Good day. I'm John Barnes. I'd like to welcome you, and I've been asked to speak to you about myofascial release. Myofascial release is a whole-body experience, an evaluation and treatment regime. And I went through severe resistance for quite a while. I still do, probably always will. And they were calling me every name in the book. People never met me before. A very interesting experience that healthcare professionals acting that way because somebody had different ideas. That was a shock to me. You know, helping people wasn't that the idea?
I really would have liked to have kept learning from John, but really it was in the company that he keeps that ultimately led to me leaving. And if you threaten those egos in any way, they got a serious arsenal of fear-based control methods to come at you with during your most vulnerable moments.
A few months ago, I made a video essay exploring some major problems in the medical research field, especially in the United States. I found out a very tight-knit community built on poor evidence and even apparent pseudoscience seems to dominate popular understanding of a condition called lipedema. I may not be a doctor or a scientist, but I am interested in studying science and trying to break it down for other people. Actually, I'm especially interested in bad science, because there's a shocking amount of it circulating not just amongst the lay public, but also within the realm of accepted science too. I left off that lipedema video with the promise that I had a lot more to say. While I was researching, I actually had to create a separate document full of the rabbit trails I wanted to go down, or I never would have gotten done. If I'm being real, that one deep dive gave me enough offshoot material probably for the rest of the year. My plan for this video is to focus on one specific person from that investigation. A lot of people noticed I was particularly antagonistic towards a well-known lipedema specialist named Linda Ann Kahn. Linda Ann Kahn is just a walking red flag. Linda Ann Kahn. Linda Ann Kahn. Linda Ann herself. Linda Ann Kahn. And Linda Ann Kahn. And if you didn't watch that video, I'll give you some context. Linda Ann Kahn is an extremely popular figure in the lipedema community, even listed second on the official US standard of care guidelines. But you should be aware that she is not a doctor. Her only healthcare certification is in lymphatic drainage therapy, which is a legitimate credential, but some of her other credentials are a little more dubious. She's also a beauty therapist, an aromatherapist, a holistic health practitioner, and an integrative health coach. I mean, just as good as med school. And while I automatically cringe at integrative health coach, which is a title you can claim without any certification, by the way, I can't say everything Linda Ann promotes is bunk. Essential oils are kind of a minefield of real and fake science. A lot of people promote them for an array of illnesses without any kind of evidence, but there is some evidence aromatherapy can be helpful for some things, like anxiety and nausea. It's not a replacement for treatment, but it is a tool. And lymphatic drainage is also a real treatment recommended for things like lymphedema and venous disease. But Linda Ann takes these things way too far. She makes a ton of claims that are either unfounded or completely refutable.
What you're thinking goes into all the cells in your body and translates to that, so we want to be very positive all the time. But 70% of your immune system is in your gut. Get yourself a dog, let the dog lick you, and go outside and play in the dirt.
Linda Ann Kahn was one of the major forces that drove me to look into lipedema research more critically. She was my first glimpse into the truly bonkers nonsense promoted by the US Standard of Care Committee. I give you all that background because I initially planned to do a deep dive on Linda Ann Kahn. But once again, what started as basic research has exploded into something much crazier. I don't know why this keeps happening. So let's start where I started. I already knew Linda Ann had questionable beliefs, but imagine my surprise when I found out she did an interview with a psychic website. The website is called Mystic Mag, and they discuss a lot more than just psychics, although fear not, they do plenty of that. If you visit their blog, you can also learn about Reiki, astrology, past life regression, and communication with animals and the dead. They also did an interview with someone who calls herself the Glamour Witch, and I mention that just because that name is sick and I wish I'd come up with it myself. A number of these interviews discuss integrating these alternative practices with conventional medicine. And there's a lot to be said about how helpful a spiritual practice can be for a lot of people. I'll go ahead and give my disclaimer that I am an atheist, and as I've said before, I don't have a spiritual bone in my body. But that being said, I won't refute that a lot of people can benefit from religion and spirituality. You can be a spiritual person and still accept and practice science and medicine. But I do think a lot of people who practice conventional medicine would take issue with the posts on this site. And I find it concerning that Linda Ann is content to put herself amongst the ranks of these other practitioners. At first I thought maybe she didn't fully understand what kind of interview she was doing. Alternative medicine and sort of fringe spiritual practices do often go hand in hand, but that's not always the case. But no worries, Linda Ann fits right in. The first time I smelled Lang Lang essential oil, I felt transported to another dimension. Despite being young and inexperienced in the spiritual realm, it evoked feelings of being in Egypt. I would love for her to explain exactly how it feels to be spiritually in Egypt. And this is a generalization, but I've noticed a lot of spiritual people, especially white people, love to co-opt other cultures as part of their practices. Egypt is a big one, and also various Native American and Asian cultures. Too often, various cultural practices get chewed up and spit out into a soup of modern spirituality. And I'm just another white person, but to me that feels uncomfortable. In light of what this website was about, I was disappointed but not surprised to hear Linda Ann say these kinds of things. But okay, she said that was her feeling, and I can't really refute that. But let's look at some of the other things she said in this interview. Recently, I gave a talk on aromatherapy for lymphedema and lipedema, blending the emotional and spiritual aspects of chronic illness. Recently, I made a blend called Peace, which has been sent to people in areas where there has been war. Let me tell you, aromatherapy can truly elevate your state of being. Take this blend I've crafted. It contains Fregonia from Australia, which opens the heart, Palo Santo that connects to the spiritual realm, and Neroli, known for its ability to help with grief and trauma while boosting endorphins. These oils, when combined, uplift your spirit and raise your vibrations. It's incredible. I agree, that is incredible. Yes, clearly, I am a hater. But I'm mostly just bewildered that Linda Ann was able to slip through the cracks and become such a widely respected expert in the medical research field. I'm willing to accept that there are truly people who believe in this stuff and find it helpful. My main issue is that there's very limited evidence for a lot of the things Linda Ann promotes. And if you're going to insert yourself into the field of hard science, you need to back up your claims with a lot more than just vibes. But this interview with Mystic Mag is an extreme example. Most of the non-scientific things Linda Ann says are a little more sneaky. She's able to spout medical language and sound like a pro, but the things she says are not actually backed up by science.
Therapists go through intensive certification, understanding the physiology and anatomy of the lymph system, decongest the tissue, helps with toxic waste in the body.
Pseudoscience is sometimes hard to spot unless you already know the dog whistles and red flags to look for, especially because a lot of things Linda Ann promotes are real therapies. She just piles a bunch of other claims on top of them. Unfortunately, I found this interview after I made that lipedema video. If I'd found it before, I probably would have gone a lot harder on her than I did. Because yes, a lot of her language is sneaky, but this was blatant, and it made me scrutinize everything she said even more closely. One of my major concerns with Linda Ann Kahn is her focus on emotional trauma and how it relates to physical symptoms. I want to be clear that I'm not saying emotional issues can't cause physical symptoms. I know from firsthand experience that my own anxiety usually manifests physically. Psychosomatic symptoms are very real and incredibly difficult to identify and treat. I think this is an under-recognized and misunderstood area of study, and I really do wish there was more research there. But Linda Ann, once again, takes this concept way too far. She makes frequent claims about the body storing or recording traumatic events.
We're going to look how trauma is stored in this extracellular matrix, and we're going to explore the extracellular matrix, which is part of the fascia.
If you're familiar with Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, or Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory, or you spend a lot of time on social media, you've probably heard of this concept before. This has been kind of a point of contention when I brought it up in the past, but a lot of the psychological community highly criticizes this theory for its lack of evidence. A small but very loud group is mostly responsible for popularizing it. Doesn't that sound familiar? I think there are very good reasons to dismiss this theory, but that would take me a long time to explain, so trust me, this is on my rabbit trails list. In one of the interviews I watched, Linda Ann brought up this theory in reference to some questionable claims about the fascia.
Trauma, surgery, or inflammation can cause a malfunction of the fascial system, and then everything binds down and there's an abnormal pressure on the nerves and muscles. My teacher, John Barnes, has a lot to say about this, and when you have myofascial release sessions, that you can actually see and witness this release of the trauma that has been in the tissue for sometimes for years and years and years.
Linda Ann is talking about a specific type of massage therapy called myofascial release, or MFR. And as I mentioned in the lipedema video, the idea that massage can release emotional trauma sounds like nonsense to me. I came away from that video assuming this teacher of hers, and maybe the technique itself, were just as much of a sham as I think Linda Ann Kahn is. I mean, I think the body keeps the score is already questionable. Saying the emotions are literally stuck in your fascia and you need to massage them out is even more nuts to me. But I wanted to do my due diligence, so I looked up myofascial release just to see if there was any merit behind it. Maybe this was just Linda Ann promoting a real therapy in the wrong way yet again. It turns out that Linda Ann's teacher that she mentioned, John Barnes, was actually the founder of myofascial release therapy. John Barnes' website, myofascialrelease.com, describes MFR as, quote, a safe and very effective hands-on technique that involves applying gentle, sustained pressure into the myofascial connective tissue restrictions to eliminate pain and restore motion, end quote. That sounds perfectly reasonable to me. This is a massage technique after all, and that's the kind of description I would expect. But then the description goes on to say, quote, trauma, inflammatory responses, and/or surgical procedures create myofascial restrictions, end quote. Uh-oh. But let's take a moment to talk about trauma, because there are multiple definitions of trauma, right? Linda Ann Kahn talked about releasing emotional trauma, but it sounds like this definition is talking about physical trauma, something like blunt force trauma. And I am willing to believe massage could help with that kind of pain. But when you look at another page on this website, Problems MFR Helps, you see where Linda Ann may have gotten this idea. It certainly does list emotional trauma as a problem MFR can help, although you may notice that it doesn't explicitly tie the act of massage to the emotional healing. It specifically says, quote, MFR provides a safe, non-judgmental environment in which suppressed feelings can be expressed and released, end quote. That sounds pretty different than what Linda Ann Kahn suggested. She made it sound like the massage itself releases the trauma, but this website seems to portray the experience completely differently. Instead, it's the safe, relaxing environment that can allow a client to express their feelings and experience catharsis. I wouldn't put that on par with conventional psychological therapy, but it sounds helpful. At this stage of my research, I was ready to pin all the blame onto Linda Ann. After all, she already has this basis of believing unfounded claims about the mind-body connection, amongst other things. I thought there was a good chance Linda Ann was fudging John Barnes' words a little bit to lend credibility to her own claims. And that was really frustrating to me. What if I just dismissed this whole therapy because Linda Ann's description of it was wrong? My biggest irritation with Linda Ann Kahn is that her wild theories have been placed side by side with real science. When someone layers unfounded claims on top of founded claims, that can sort of legitimize those unfounded claims to an audience that doesn't know any better. That's why it's so dangerous that the most prominent lipedema specialist in the US, Dr. Karen Herbst, collaborates with Linda Ann. Well, a medical doctor thinks this stuff is great, so surely that means it's scientifically backed, right? But on the flip side, mixing founded and unfounded claims can also delegitimize the founded claims. Just because people like Linda Ann promote lymphatic drainage and aromatherapy for detoxing, and a ton of other things without good evidence, that doesn't mean we have to throw out the entire concepts. There's still real treatments. It's a shame because these type of practitioners mystify real science and can make people like me skeptical of things that are actually evidence-based. Maybe I was too quick to judge myofascial release just because Linda Ann is associated with it. At least, that was my impression at the start. But sad to say, John Barnes doesn't get out of all of this scot-free. Let's revisit that page on his website, Problems MFR Helps. I couldn't help but notice that this was quite a long and varied list. Experiencing any of the following conditions or diagnoses? This is only a partial list of the conditions that we can help. Oh boy! Back pain, bladder problems, birth injuries, bulging disc, bursitis, carpal tunnel, cerebral palsy, cervical injuries, chronic fatigue, chronic pain, degenerative disc disease, endometriosis, emotional trauma, fibromyalgia, frozen shoulder, herniated disc, headaches and migraines, infertility, interstitial cystitis, menstrual problems, myofascial pain, neck pain, osteoarthritis, pelvic pain, plantar fasciitis, pudendal nerve entrapment, scars, sciatica, scoliosis, shin splints, tennis elbow, tinnitus, TMJ, trigeminal neuralgia, vulvodynia, and whiplash. I think a list of things myofascial release can't help would be shorter, and I can't say that all these claims are wrong. Myofascial release is a type of physical therapy. Did I believe it could help with back pain? Probably. Frozen shoulder? Sure. Myofascial pain? I would hope so. But this huge list did worry me. I found it especially concerning that John Barnes claims MFR can help with things like cerebral palsy, infertility, and yes, emotional trauma, even if it is more of a side benefit. These are things that are not only extremely difficult to live with, but they're also vulnerabilities that are often exploited by people trying to sell bogus cures. I am automatically skeptical of anything that sweeps those types of conditions into the same list with things like tennis elbow. But I still felt like I shouldn't just dismiss MFR out of hand. I hadn't even heard of it before, so maybe there was good evidence behind it. But on the other hand, I already felt like John Barnes had some strikes against him. Alright, I won't bury the lead anymore. We're about to go on quite an adventure.
What is myofascial release therapy?
So what is myofascial release? How is it different from other types of massage therapy? When you imagine massage, you probably have a couple of images in mind. Something like a relaxing spa, or maybe a deep tissue massage where they mash the crap out of you. John Barnes' myofascial release therapy is nothing like either of those things. I would say it's only called massage by technicality because it's mostly stretching the client in certain positions for extended periods of time.
The patella is being pulled out of the prepatellar groove. It's not tracking properly. Irritation is beginning to occur in the joint surface as they go through flexion and extension. A nice patellar technique is to grab the patella, push the patella caudally gently until you take the slack out of the system, cross your hands, and wait for the system to release. Again, I'm speeding through things now for demonstration purposes, or you can get under the patella if it's not moving well in that direction. You'll be pushing that way. The other thing that I do is I make a claw with my hands. Now you have some patella mobilizers that you can find in most of the professional journals now. They're sort of like a little suction, which you can also use, but your hands work quite fine. I'm going to grab his patella and pull toward the ceiling. In other words, I am disengaging the patella from the tracking mechanism, and I'm freeing up the fascia that lies underneath of that to allow for more mobility.
John Barnes theorizes that a lot of chronic pain and other issues on that list originate in the fascia. Fascia is a connective tissue that encases everything in your body, from organs to muscles to blood vessels. The myo in myofascial release refers to muscles. So this type of therapy focuses on relaxing both the muscles and the surrounding fascia. And like I said, it's really not so much massage as it is controlled stretching. The theory is that scarring or stiffening in the fascia, what Barnes calls restrictions, can cause a cascade of other issues. For example, say you broke your ankle and it healed crooked or stiff. That may affect your posture, which may lead to pain in your back or your neck or your shoulders. I'm sure a lot of us have experienced the type of pain that comes from overcompensating for another injury. I've seen several patient testimonials say they went in for MFR for one specific pain, only to find out that the source of the pain was in a completely different area. In our ankle example, maybe the patient has back pain but doesn't realize that their old ankle injury is contributing to that, especially if the ankle doesn't even bother them anymore. An MFR practitioner may assess the patient from a standing position and notice their stance is asymmetrical. So instead of just focusing on the patient's back pain, they would try to find the source of the asymmetry. In our example, they would perform myofascial release on the ankle to loosen the stiffness and hopefully allow the patient to stand straighter and relieve the back pain. To me, this makes a lot of sense. John Barnes talks a lot about how conventional medicine focuses too much on symptoms without getting to the root of the problem. I don't think it would be uncommon for a patient to go to the doctor for back pain and be prescribed painkillers or muscle relaxers, maybe even surgery. Would a doctor trace the problem to an ankle that had healed years ago, especially if the patient didn't think it was relevant to mention? I'm sure some would, but not all. I'd venture to say not most. Alright, so I thought the theory behind myofascial release had merit, but do we have evidence that backs up John Barnes' claims?
Scientific evidence?
There aren't a lot of studies on myofascial release. A lot of the papers I found were actually systematic reviews of the limited studies we have. I have found a few studies that claim MFR perform better than placebo or better than other types of physical therapy. But as I've come to learn, you can't always take a study at face value. Placebos in drug trials are pretty straightforward. Just give the control group a fake pill or a fake injection. But with treatments like physical therapy, it's much more difficult to come up with a placebo that matches the experiment. How do you give someone a fake massage? Experimenters have to get more creative when testing things like this. And my problem with a few of these MFR studies is that their choice of placebo doesn't feel adequate to me. Keep in mind, I'm not an expert, so take what I'm saying here with a grain of salt. One study I looked at used a sham laser therapy in their control group. They used what they call commercially available lasers, which I have to assume means laser pointers. The researchers did attempt to make the fake laser therapy seem legitimate. They had both the therapist and the patient wear safety goggles to give the impression that the lasers were powerful. And they put binders of information about laser therapy in the room. But let's be so for real. I can't believe everyone in the control group was fooled by this. To the researchers' credit, they recognize this. They say, quote, "The present study's results indicate that the fascial interventions experienced seemed more convincing for participants than the laser intervention, leading to significant differences in credibility and expectancy ratings in our study," end quote. In other words, the subjects of the study were more convinced that the myofascial release therapy was legitimate. And I feel like the whole point of a placebo is that it seems just as legitimate as the experimental treatment. If the control group isn't buying it, they might not get as much of a placebo effect. A couple of other studies used a fake ultrasound treatment as a placebo, which sounds better to me. Real ultrasound can be a legitimate treatment for chronic pain. But another study just had the placebo therapist place their hands in the same areas that the MFR therapist did, but with no movement. Again, who is buying that? If the therapist is not actually massaging or stretching you in any way, how would that treatment work? Thoughts and prayers? Placebos and blinding are extremely important to this process. We need to be able to prove that a treatment does work beyond the placebo effect. And as I'm starting to realize, sometimes coming up with an adequate placebo is difficult. It is not a very well-regulated process. Now, what I'm not saying is that we should dismiss these studies entirely and conclude that MFR doesn't work. I'm just saying that some of these studies don't seem sufficient to make any kind of definitive claims. The next step is to work out the flaws and also replicate the studies with larger sample sizes. Because another flaw is that, generally speaking, the sample sizes in most of these studies is quite small. One of the most compelling studies I could find compared myofascial release to various conventional physical therapy methods. In this study, both MFR and conventional PT did improve neck pain, but MFR did perform about 20% better than PT, at least for the short period of time that was observed. That's at least a good start, though again, it was a pretty small study that needs to be replicated. Not to mention, all that study suggested was that MFR might improve neck pain better than traditional PT. It didn't look into all the other claims from that huge list from John Barnes' website. But there's one glaring problem with these studies that really puzzled me. They don't say whether these patients are specifically suffering from fascial restrictions. Subjects were usually chosen based on where and how they experience chronic pain. But if MFR is supposed to work by releasing the restrictions in the fascia, don't the subjects need that diagnosis first? Well, turns out that's a whole other can of worms.
Myofascial restrictions and trigger points.
I should mention that John Barnes wasn't the first person to theorize that the fascia plays a huge role in chronic pain. One of the most famous proponents of general myofascial therapy was Dr. Janet Travell, personal physician to President John F. Kennedy. Starting around the 1940s, Dr. Travell researched and published on the concept of myofascial trigger points, which are thought of as knots or nodules in the myofascial tissue that may cause pain or referred pain in other areas, which sounds to me like a similar concept to restrictions. The first person to coin the term myofascial release was an osteopath named Robert Ward in 1960. Coincidentally, John Barnes also created his myofascial release technique in 1960, but his techniques are much different than Robert Ward's, and both are different from Dr. Travell's. Robert Ward myofascial release involves very deep tissue massage. John Barnes' myofascial release, as you probably noticed, is much gentler. Like I said, it's mostly sustained stretching. Dr. Travell pioneered the use of several treatments that are still in use today, including dry needling, which is kind of like an aggressive acupuncture. There's a lot of controversy surrounding dry needling and a lot of disagreement about whether it can be compared to acupuncture or not. Dr. Travell argued that acupuncture needles were too thin to treat myofascial trigger points, so she used hypodermic needles instead. But nothing is injected into the body, hence the term dry needling. A lot of people still promote dry needling to this day, though reviews are mixed. Makes me a little queasy to think about, so let's move on. All three of these techniques are quite different, but they rely on the same theory. Specific points of irritability in the fascia cause pain or referred pain in other areas. The only problem with that theory is that there isn't a concrete definition of what myofascial trigger points or restrictions actually are or how to diagnose them. John Barnes doesn't shy away from that fact either. He says on his website, and I've heard him say in other places, quote, myofascial restrictions can produce tensile pressures of approximately 2,000 pounds per square inch on pain-sensitive structures that do not show up in many of the standard tests, end quote. After reading that, I had a couple of questions. Number one, if you can't detect the restrictions with tests, how do you know they're there? I've seen John Barnes suggest that a seasoned myofascial release therapist can feel the restrictions.
Without sliding, the first give you feel is the elastic and muscular component. You then come to a dead halt. That will be the collagenous barrier. We wait there, give it time, and eventually, somewhere around 90 to 120 seconds or longer, as the release occurs, it kind of feels like butter melting, and the sacrum kind of starts to open like a ratchet. You just follow it as you continue with your body weight to pull toward their feet.
I mean, color me skeptical, because if something is so obvious that a human being can feel it with their hands, how on earth can you not detect that on any kind of test? Once again, I am not a medical professional, so I wondered if there were any tests for other problems in the fascia. And yes, there are. Ultrasound and MRI can detect things like fascial lesions, tears, and adhesions. Alright, so that would mean whatever John Barnes is calling restrictions are not those. It seems that restriction is just a general term for fascial tightness or tenderness. But we have no tests or imaging, no solid proof that these exist in the way that John Barnes describes them. And the same can be said for myofascial trigger points. They're often described as knots or nodules in the muscle that are typically diagnosed by feel. There has been imaging that suggests there could be something there that corresponds to the palpable nodule, but these findings are inconsistent, and there's still no consensus about what exactly a trigger point is or how it should be diagnosed. It's even more complicated because people can have muscle knots without chronic pain, and people can have chronic muscle pain without knots as well. So the question currently debated in the medical field is, are these trigger points knots in the muscle, and do those knots in the muscle cause pain? And I recognize that even acknowledging that there is a debate is extremely controversial. Plenty of physical therapists and osteopaths and other professionals, not to mention people suffering with chronic pain, swear by trigger points or restrictions. They say they can feel the knots in the myofascial tissue, the knots cause the pain, and common myofascial treatments targeting those work. Maybe they're right. Unfortunately, though, the theory does have quite a few problems. And to repeat, in no way am I suggesting that myofascial pain isn't real. I just think we don't have enough evidence that the pain is caused by these poorly described trigger points. Now I have to acknowledge what a lot of people familiar with this are probably screaming at their screens. You're conflating myofascial trigger points and myofascial restrictions. Maybe, but trigger points and restrictions are both such vague and similarly described terms. I've seen trigger points referred to as knots in the myofascial tissue, whereas restrictions seem to refer to tightness or stiffness instead, except when that's not the case. I've also seen therapists refer to trigger points as taut bands in the muscle, and I've seen therapists call restrictions knots or adhesions. A lot of people who promote the trigger point theory also believe there's a range of trigger points, from latent to acute. I assume that what John Barnes calls restrictions could fall within that range. I felt like since this concept was the very foundation of myofascial release therapy, I needed to understand the arguments for and against. A lot of the arguments against myofascial trigger points could also be applied to restrictions. You can't detect them with imaging, practitioners are just supposed to feel them out, and one of the biggest pieces of evidence that they exist in the way they're described is that the pain is supposed to improve with these targeted treatments. My takeaway is if the commonly accepted concept of myofascial trigger points is merely a hypothesis, That would mean we have even less evidence of restrictions, if they're even something different at all. And the main reason I have to look at arguments for and against trigger points rather than restrictions is because basically the only sources I could find even defining restrictions are MFR websites. This term is very specific to John Barnes' method, and to me it feels like an issue that we have so little evidence of the very foundation of the practice. That's unfortunate, but again, I wouldn't say that means we have to discard MFR. There are plenty of treatments that we can try without hard evidence. At this stage, I would call the evidence behind the various myofascial therapies soft evidence, if you will. Okay, so that sort of answers my first question. How do you know restrictions exist if you can't test for them? I think at this point I'm willing to accept the concept of restrictions, even if that concept is more of a useful metaphor. It troubles me then that the founder of Myofascial Release, John Barnes, feels so comfortable telling us not only exactly what he thinks restrictions are, but how they affect the body.
What do restrictions do?
So, according to John Barnes, all of those conditions he listed on his website are related to restrictions, or tight areas of fascia. As a refresher, John claims myofascial restrictions can produce tensile pressures of approximately 2,000 pounds per square inch on pain-sensitive structures. This is a figure he and his followers quote often, 2,000 pounds per square inch.
2,000 pounds per square inch.
2,000 pounds per square inch, that's 2 full-grown horses standing on a nerve.
Up to 2,000 pounds per square inch. It's crushing pressure.
Up to 2,000 pounds per square inch. Crushing pressure.
This pressure, believe it or not, which is approximately 2,000 pounds per square inch.
He often compares that pressure to 2 horses standing on a nerve. If that's the case, then yeah, I can understand why these people are suffering. My second question is just, how do you know? I felt like this figure must correlate to a specific study or accepted finding. Naturally, I Googled it, as you do. And, well, allow me to take you on the journey. I looked up 2,000 pounds per square inch fascia, or something like that, and what I found were quite a few myofascial release websites making this claim, including several by John Barnes himself, but no actual studies. Already off to a wonderful start. Through a convoluted series of searches, I did eventually find an article that included a citation. It was on a website called Dragonfly Qigong, and Qigong is apparently a Chinese meditation practice. Apologies for my poor pronunciation.
Let me show you the proper way to pronounce it. Qigong.
This article, called Fascia Qigong, was written by someone named Sifu Steve Green. So it turns out this 2,000 pounds per square inch figure was actually rounded up from the true figure, which is 1,977.04 pounds per square inch. But that's fine. John Barnes did say approximately. It certainly didn't help my search any, though. I could go through this article itself, but I hope you'll forgive me for not taking an article by Sifu Steve Green, interspersed with clip art, as gospel, but I will take your citation, sir. Thank you so much. Apparently this study was by Kei Katake of the Kyoto Prefectural University of Medicine from 1961, and the paper is called The Strength for Tension and Bursting of Human Fascia. Perfect. Now let's look up the paper. Friends, when I tell you I did some major digging looking for any other source of this paper, I think it complicates things that this was a Japanese study, and it's very possible that my American English Googling just won't cut it. I tried searching the university's website and Japanese medical journals. I couldn't even manage to find out who Kei Katake was. What does the K stand for? The world may never know. So my question is then, where did John get this? Why is it that the only English copy I can find is on his website? And besides that, just look at it. Look at what's actually there when I click the link. Forgive me, Kei Katake, but this is not a study. It is a single page of findings with no methodology, no analysis or discussion of the data. Nothing. These figures apparently came from studying 4 cadavers, but we don't know how they got these numbers. How did they measure strength and tension? Are these figures averages? Are there any outliers? I mean, if you can have outliers when you have 4 subjects in your study. I can't even blame Kei Kitake. I really have no way to know if this is the entire paper, since this is the only place I can find it, on John Barnes' website. But as frustrating as this whole enterprise was, I actually don't think this paper matters at all. Let's take a step back. What was the original claim by John Barnes? Myofascial restrictions can produce tensile pressures of approximately 2,000 pounds per square inch. And the only source I can find for that claim is this supposed study, but it doesn't even say that. The almost 2,000 pounds per square inch refers to the general tensile strength of the fascia, how much force it can withstand before it breaks, and that's just assuming these findings are correct. So how can John extrapolate that figure to make his claims? We can't even test for restrictions, so how can we know how many pounds of pressure they produce? Also, forgive me if I'm just ignorant, but how can fascia within the human body exert the same amount of pressure as cadaver fascia stretched out to the point of breaking? It just doesn't add up to me. So why do all of these MFR and MFR adjacent websites reference this? They also aren't able to provide the source. I mean, a few of them do cite this paper, which is clearly problematic, but quite a few just state the 2,000 pounds per square inch figure as if it's fact, with no citation at all. It seems to me that this has been a decades-long game of telephone. It's been repeated and spread so often that people just accept it as fact. This whole wild goose chase was incredibly irritating, and unfortunately I was in public when I was unfolding all of this. Apologies to everyone else in that cafe that probably saw me making this face. But like I said, the paper itself isn't even that important. What concerns me is the claim, who originally made the claim, and why he made the claim. It became increasingly clear to me the more I looked into MFR that I needed to more closely examine the founder, John F. Barnes. How did he come up with myofascial release in the first place, and how did he come to make all of these claims?
John F. Barnes, founder of myofascial release.
Alright, so I may have buried the lead a bit. I love a twist. But considering this entire practice is traced back to one guy, I'm sure a lot of you saw this coming. You probably noticed I have never referred to John F. Barnes as Dr. Barnes, because he's not. But he is a licensed physical therapist. He actually worked as a conventional physical therapist before coming up with this technique and starting his own practice. He's in his 80s now, but he's still practicing MFR and teaching the technique to this day. The story of how he discovered myofascial release is kind of wild. I've watched and listened to several interviews he's given, and he usually tells this story in all of them.
I kind of stumbled into all this because of my own back problems. I had been an athlete. I had run track, played football, swam. I was a weightlifter.
And I had been an athlete when I was younger. And I played football, and I ran track, I skied, and I swam, I drove motorcycles, and got involved in competitive weightlifting, competitive karate. Basically, I love motion, and I love competition.
I was an athlete when I was younger, and I used to run a lot and played football. I ran track, I threw the shot put, I skied, I drove motorcycles. I got involved in competitive karate and weightlifting. And basically, I love motion, I love competition.
And in my teens, I had fallen with over 300 pounds and severely injured my back.
And one day I went down to work out, and there was nobody in the gym. And I was doing squats with somewhere over 300 pounds. And I got to the point where I couldn't get up. I had no way to help me. So I'd been a gymnast when I was younger. So I thought I'd just do a back roll. But when you have a 300-pound bar in your hands don't let go. So I crashed into the ground with tremendous force, and I ruptured the disc at L5, that's the lower back area. I ripped a lot of ligaments. And I laid there totally stunned. And I felt numb from the waist down. And I had to crawl out of the gym. I laugh at it now, but it was horrible, you know.
And I went down to the gym one day to work out, and there was nobody there to spot me. And I was squatting with somewhere over 300 pounds, and I couldn't get up after a while. So I've been a gymnast when I was younger, so I thought I'd just do a back roll, get out of it. Forgetting when you have a 300-pound bar in your hands don't let go. So I landed very forcibly on my sacrum and lumbar area. I ripped some of the ligaments, I herniated the disc at L5. I laid there totally stunned, pretty much numb from the waist down. Couldn't move. Eventually, the numbness started to wear off, and then the pain began. My legs started to slowly move again. I had to crawl out. It's funny, going back, I think it's funny now, you know. But
John goes on to explain that he did get spinal fusion surgery, and it did help at first, but he still experienced pain.
And it was sort of my attempt, my struggle basically, to help myself. Unfortunately, traditional physical therapy and ultimately surgery had failed me, and I had to help myself somehow.
And I tried every form of therapy known to mankind, and nothing helped, unless temporary results. So he suggested I see an orthopedic surgeon to get a spinal fusion. So I went and I got the surgery. The fusion did help, but I was still in a lot of pain. I still couldn't really move that well.
At that point also, I'd had spinal surgery. My back pain had become unbearable, but still I was hurting, couldn't move that well.
He talks a lot about how he loved competitive sports, and obviously he couldn't do that anymore after the injury or after the surgery. That injury was part of the reason he decided to become a physical therapist, and he regularly performed treatments on himself to try to improve his symptoms.
So out of total desperation, really, I started to treat myself, and I would do that on the living room floor. And so it was my low back area. So laying on the living room floor, I started to push into that area. But I was still very strong, and I was trying to bull my way through. And over time, I learned to be more gentle. That over time, I learned if I waited longer, that I was starting to get a dramatic turnaround in my pain and my ability to move again. As I treated myself, I was having these strange sensations. They were far away from the origin and insertion of muscle the way I was trained in anatomy. And I started to realize that maybe what I was dealing with was the fascial system, but I hadn't had much training in school.
It sounds to me like John's discovery was a happy accident, or more like an educated accident. He already had a foundation of physical therapy, but he says he let his intuition guide him into this technique.
I go back to when I used to treat myself on my living room floor. So what I didn't tell you was there was one night my back was really hurting bad, and I was laying on my back, I was laying on my belly, and I put my hand back on my sacrum, which is the lower bone in your back. That's where my surgery had been. And I started to move spontaneously, and the pain was building, and it felt almost electric. And I was getting scared I might injure myself. I was about to take my hand off when I heard my intuition say to me, "Wait until it releases." Now, again, I had great trust in my intuition, as most of us did when we were very young. But again, school kind of beat out our intuition. But I listened to my intuition.
That's something John values above all else. Intuition. I personally wouldn't call that the best way to develop a treatment, but I know John would have some things to say about that. We'll get there. Since John was a practicing physical therapist, he tried his new technique on his clients, and he started developing a more concrete theory behind how and why it works. The theory of myofascial release is pretty straightforward. If restrictions in your fascia cause pain and other symptoms, you need to relax or release these restrictions. MFR is pretty unique in that it seems to be more patient-guided than practitioner-guided. The therapist is just kind of a facilitator. They may guide the patient by moving and stretching them in certain ways, but from what I can tell, oftentimes the patient is encouraged to move intuitively, like John did when he discovered the technique. The practitioner's job is to support the patient and eliminate the factor of gravity so that the patient can stretch in whatever way they need to.
Maybe you want to try this yourselves. You can stand or sit. And as you stretch, just notice within that stretch is a motion. It's almost like you're beginning to fall into space. That's your direction of ease. Trust it. Go with it. So pretend like you're telescoping or elongating, and allow your body, your spine, your head, your neck to go wherever it feels right. And there'll be times when you stop, and when you stop, that's where the restriction is. Your body knows where it is. So your body-mind complex can really take care of you with these techniques, and you stop and wait until you get that sense of elongation, like butter melting or taffy stretching. You never force. This is not something you're consciously doing except the stretch part. You let the deeper part of you take care of yourself now. It's very graceful. It's like a form of dance in a way.
Sounds pretty unusual, but if it works, it works. But does it work? It's hard to say. Like I said before, a lot of the scientific papers I found on MFR are just systematic reviews of other very limited studies. Most of them find MFR promising for some chronic pain conditions, but they point to a lack of larger studies and mixed results from the studies we do have. So while I can't say that MFR doesn't work, I also can't say that it does. We don't have scientific consensus yet. Most of the evidence we have is purely anecdotal. And I have no problem with anecdotal evidence as a starting point. You can't have a study without a hypothesis. But a lot of these anecdotes I've seen are so passionate and insistent that myofascial release is the solution to so many different problems, to the point that they promote it over conventional medicine. And naturally, no one promotes it harder than the founder of myofascial release himself, John Barnes. What I find so fascinating about John Barnes is that while most scientists would prioritize empirical evidence over anecdotal evidence, John is very much the opposite.
There is an art to this. Don't worry about it. You will get the feel, but take all pressure off yourself today to have to get the feel. Just allow yourself to be quiet. As I said yesterday, this is a physical learning we're doing. It goes beyond intellectual learning. Just allow yourself to get it without worrying about it, and it'll come to you in its own way at your own pace. Even doing this mechanically, you're going to have superb results. But as you learn to tune into the feel, you become a true therapeutic artist. I don't know if the camera's picking it up, but under her chin, hyoid region, cheeks are getting very red. Vasomotor response. Always look for the vasomotor response. It's totally unpredictable. It's different with everybody, every day. The body's lighting up like a Christmas tree. It's trying to get your attention. Say, treat me here. And wherever they had a sensation, as illogical as it may seem, treat those areas. Your left brain will say, what the hell does that have to do with the symptoms? If it's in their body, it has everything to do with it. We have to stop being linear. We've deprived ourselves of the wisdom of our body by trying to apply linear principles to a nonlinear system. Remember, it's so simple, your left brain will reject it. So just bypass the left brain. Thank you.
Well, first of all, the concept of being right-brained or left-brained is nothing. Whether you're a more creative person or a more logical person is not determined by any hemisphere dominance in the brain. I'm sure John and I would get along swimmingly. Second of all, wouldn't this imply that MFR is kind of unfalsifiable? If by definition MFR has to be intuitive and not logical in order to work, how would we be able to empirically test that? Well, according to John, scientific research isn't that important.
I had read this book. I had been using this book for about 3 years. I was super left-brained because I was finishing my doctorate and being a PT at the same time, and just, research. And John, you and I have had this discussion about research, and you just kind of roll your eyes at me when I would talk about research when I first met you.
Let me back up a little bit. You mentioned research. See, what scientists don't look at is the meta paradigm, which is, if consciousness doesn't matter, then all of the theories that emanate from that are built upon that as if it was a reality. I have great respect for researchers that build computers, bridges, architecture, on and on and on, objects. But we're not an object. We're not a bunch of widgets to be stacked up and quantified. We have a consciousness. We cannot deny it. And unfortunately, by ignoring the consciousness, this is why most healthcare has been of temporary nature at best.
And it was at this moment that I said, oh, okay, I understand what we're dealing with here. Look, I hope I've demonstrated myself to be the type of person who gives people the benefit of the doubt. I really hope you think that, because I'm about to be very unkind to Mr. Barnes. As much as I wanted to believe that his mission was to help people, I no longer think that's the case. It's my opinion that John F. Barnes is completely and entirely full of shit.
John Barnes hates intellectuals, but wants to be one so badly.
As you probably noticed, John has some very strong opinions about scientists and doctors. One of his main issues with conventional medicine is their focus on symptoms rather than the root cause.
That starts to produce effects we call symptoms. But healthcare just looked at symptoms, the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. It almost seems like that's getting worse these days. As I have patients come in, I can imagine some of the experiences you have here with the things that have been missed because they're so relying on testing and how this doesn't show up
right
in the testing.
Right. Yeah, I'm frustrated, I guess. I thought things would get better.
I know, right?
And I can't necessarily disagree with them. I generally think that most healthcare providers do the best they can, but there are times where they fall short. I think we can place the blame in several places, but a big one is the American healthcare system. John is American, like myself, and he actually has worked in hospitals as a physical therapist. He cites dealing with insurance as one of the reasons he decided to move on to his own cash-based practice. I can understand why John felt disillusioned with the healthcare system, both as a therapist and as a patient. Limited time with doctors and limited coverage of tests and treatments does mean that patients don't always get the care they need. It makes me mad that the term holistic has become a dog whistle for pseudoscience. Healthcare professionals should be working together to assess a patient's whole being, not just individual symptoms. The way the American healthcare system is set up largely doesn't allow for that. I mean, what good is comprehensive healthcare if the CEO can't afford a new fleet of yachts this year? It's very irritating because it feels like John's concern is genuine, but he places the blame in all the wrong areas. The way he sees it, it's not the deeply flawed healthcare system's fault that people can't get treatment. It's the fault of the entire concepts of science and education.
In school, if you mention something came from your intuition, the teacher shuts you right down. And there's something called the Akashic Records, which is another word for universal wisdom, and we have access to that. And but then schooling kind of beat that out of us,
Our whole education was based on our intellect. Our education really was mass hypnosis. And it's a big problem when it gets in our way because we're fed a lot of concepts that aren't in our best interest. So Myofascial release helps us to finally think for ourselves.
I have great respect for scientists that work with computers and build bridges, that type of thing. But that's the linear world. But they try to apply those principles to a human being. It's not linear. And the problem is that science, the basis of science is objectivity. So they try to make us objects. And so to do that, they had to eliminate consciousness. There was two basic questions. Does consciousness matter or does it not matter? So science chose that it didn't matter because it was inconvenient for research.
Every interview is like this. As much as I just want to throw up my hands and say, do not trust this man, everything he says is nonsense, I do have a feeling that there are going to be some people who truly like MFR and truly like John Barnes who see this video. And the last thing I want to do is throw away the opportunity to thoroughly explain why I think this is such a problem. The first thing I want to acknowledge is that intuition is a good thing. Sometimes intuition and gut feelings can save your life. But the problem is that evolution is messy, and just because something is advantageous doesn't mean it's perfect. Pattern recognition and facial recognition are fantastic advantages to our species. But on the other hand, it also means we can be easily fooled. When I was a kid, a light outside my bedroom would cast a shadow on the wall that kind of looked like a face. I would lie awake at night staring at it, knowing it was just a shadow, but subconsciously I was still really scared of it. That instinct was incredibly useful when humans lived in the wilderness and needed to be able to spot predators in the dark. But it's much less useful when you live in a suburb and you have school in the morning. That leads to my second point, which is that children are dumb. And that's fine. They're supposed to be. They have no information. But John Barnes portrays children as paragons of wisdom, untainted by the poison of the logical education system.
In school, if you mentioned something came from your intuition, the teacher shuts you right down.
I'm sure you all heard in school when you were younger, oh, it's only your intuition. Yeah, your most valuable faculty beat out of you.
I'm sure most of you at some point, your teacher said to you, oh, it's only your intuition, and they took away the most valuable faculty you possess.
Why do I feel like this is a personal example he's been hung up on all these years? John thinks if we could just tap into our childlike intuition, we would have all the answers. And I'm sorry, but that's just demonstrably false. People who work with children can tell you that we have dozens and dozens of examples of how their underdeveloped brains cause them to intuit things incorrectly. There's a popular child development task where young children are shown two glasses of different heights. Very young children will say that the taller glass holds more liquid, even if you demonstrate that they hold the same volume. I agree that children are incredibly creative and often smarter than we give them credit for, but to say that education beats the innate wisdom out of them is just wild. It's true that the American education system is far from perfect, and a lot of kids are discouraged from engaging with their natural creativity. But that doesn't mean that logic and science are the devil, and it certainly doesn't mean they're the antithesis of intuition and creativity. The very fact that John buys into that false right brain and left brain ideology just lets me know he doesn't understand what he's talking about. To demonstrate how little he knows about science, he rants over and over again about how science has completely divided the body and the mind.
Does consciousness matter or does it not matter? So science chose that it didn't matter because it was inconvenient for research.
All research basically asked itself a question. Does consciousness matter? So traditional research decided because it was separate from the body, which it's not, but we were taught. Descartes, the father of modern medicine, separated the mind from the body hundreds and hundreds of years ago.
And once again, that's just demonstrably untrue. I mean, how many times have I referenced the placebo effect in this video? Scientists have to take the mind into account, not just in the subjects they study, but in themselves. They have to account for how different people may react to stimuli. They have to account for how different people may interpret the data. They have to account for how their own biases may skew their results. There are so many ways that the human mind can impact the way science is done. And that's not even touching the sciences of psychology and sociology, which literally study human consciousness and behavior. Or even better, neuroscience. John conveniently never seems to consider the vast amount of research specifically dedicated to understanding human consciousness. But if I had to guess, John would probably scoff at these sciences for trying to put the consciousness in a box. He seems to think of consciousness as a more abstract spiritual thing that scientists could never understand.
And there's something called the Akashic Records, which is another word for universal wisdom, and we have access to that.
It feels like John frames himself as this enlightened guru who has transcended conventional medicine. He's in touch with true healing, unlike doctors who view you as a mere machine. It's possible he really thinks that, but quite honestly, I also think it's a sales tactic. I hate to be that cynical, but I have plenty of reasons to make that case. Because as much as John rails against science and research, he sure loves it when it backs up his own claims.
There's a new book out called Ground Substance, Extracellular Matrix by an Alfred Feisinger, who's one of Germany's leading scientists. He's researched the fascial system now for 30 years. And one of the key things he says is that the ground substance is the environment of every cell of our body.
Oh, okay, so that scientist is acceptable. I'll bite. I looked up this new book, Ground Substance Extracellular Matrix, by leading German scientist Alfred Feisinger. Would you believe it if I told you basically every word of that description was wrong? The book is actually called The Extracellular Matrix and Ground Regulation by an Austrian scientist named Alfred Pischinger. Okay, so John wasn't wildly off, but he certainly did make my search harder. I've come to expect this kind of thing from him. But you know, I read up on Alfred Pischinger, and it's really interesting to me how he's been researching the fascial system for the past 30 years. Considering he's been dead since 1982. Alfred Pischinger was a prominent scientist in Austria in the 1930s and 40s. Wait, in the 30s and... Oh, don't tell me. Was he a... Yes, he was indeed a member of a certain German political party. Actually, he was illegally a member of that party since it was outlawed in Austria at the time. I won't elaborate on what kind of research he did during that time because I really don't want to talk about it, you really don't want to hear it, and I don't want this video to get demonetized. But I will tell you he was an embryologist, and I have read some horrifying things he did. I want to thank Drs. Sabina Hildebrandt and Gabrielle Zarnowski for their work in exposing the horrors of medicine from that time period. I relied on their research to learn who Alfred Pischinger was. It was very difficult because I had to wade through all the holistic and alternative medicine articles singing his praises. Did I read The Extracellular Matrix and Ground Regulation? No. Do I think that because someone did evil things that their research is automatically incorrect? Also no. But just like that fascia study by Kei Katake, I think this book is merely a distraction. Frankly, John Barnes' citations tell me a whole lot more about him than whatever scientific evidence he's trying to provide. I don't think that John likes the German National Socialist Party because he likes this book. Far from it. I think he has no idea about that connection. I don't think he knows a single thing about Alfred Pischinger. He didn't even seem to realize Pischinger was long dead or this book was published posthumously decades later. John Barnes says he dislikes science, and he continually proves it by blatantly misunderstanding it at every turn, to the point that he can't even accurately cite books or studies that supposedly back up his own beliefs. I may not have read this book, but I'm not convinced John has either, because this isn't the only interview where he got this information wrong.
Can I bring up a little research since you brought it up before too?
Please.
There's a Dr. Alfred Feisinger from Germany who studied the fascial system for over 30 years. He has a new book out called The Extracellular Matrix, Ground Substance Regulation. You probably won't be interested in it because most research books are rather boring. But I want to give you the important nuggets that were in there from 30 years of research. What Dr. Feisinger said is there is no nerve or blood vessel that touches any one of the cells of our body, which completely obliterates the whole theory of medicine and therapy.
That's a very interesting claim, considering Pischinger was a scientist himself and served in several leadership positions in the field of conventional medicine. I haven't read the book, but I have read summaries, and Pischinger did promote some alternative medicine modalities I personally don't buy, but I'm skeptical that he would accept John's conclusion that his work overturned science. And while I'm on the subject of bad citations, Let's revisit that Keikatake study again, the strength for tension and bursting of human fascia. Because John likes to trot out that 2,000 pounds per square inch figure constantly.
2,000 pounds per square inch.
His major problem with scientific studies on the fascia, he says, is that they're always done on dead people.
All of research that's been done on the fascial system has been done on dead people. Dead people are brittle, and dead people don't have consciousness. And that's the model of reality we as therapists and physicians learned. Basically, we learned about dead people without consciousness or a fascial system and paid no attention to the fluidity of our body.
And at first, that seems like a reasonable argument. Well, I don't know about the consciousness part, but the part about dead fascia being brittle sounds like a good point. But Mr. Barnes, you may want to revisit your fascia study again, because if you'll remember, that study was apparently conducted on 4 cadavers. Was their fascia brittle, or was it able to withstand almost 2,000 pounds of tension?
2,000 pounds.
Oh, and he's also completely wrong. Just look up fascia study in vivo, and you will find 7 septillion studies about fascia in living human beings. You're welcome, John. I made the point in another video that some people are sneaky in how they cite sources and short-form content like TikTok. They throw a study up on the screen knowing full well that most people are going to immediately forget and not look it up. It allows them to misrepresent data while also looking well-researched. I think that's also true of stuff like these John Barnes interviews. What are the chances that most people who come across these interviews will A, remember the name of a random book, or B, fact check what John said? Obviously, this was incredibly frustrating to me just researching from the outside, but it's even more frustrating when I think about the people on the inside. I feel like most people's introductions to John and MFR are radically different than mine. They probably start by hearing how good myofascial release is and trying it out. If they have a good experience, they probably go on to explore more, maybe watching these interviews or taking his classes or reading his books. And if they're coming in already thinking of MFR as a therapy that really works, they're primed to trust the founder and the citations he gives. And that's not really their fault. Why would they think this credentialed physical therapist could be so wrong? I tried to approach this with an open mind, but I was biased by one of John's students, Linda Ann Kahn. But even with that background, I still came away from his website thinking, maybe she's just one bad apple. This seems fine. If I didn't watch these interviews and listen to John's own words, I never would have known about all this loony stuff. And if I didn't have, again, a background interest in pseudoscience and developing knowledge on how to read scientific papers, I probably wouldn't have known that I should fact check his claims or how to fact check them. The reason I say this seems like a sales tactic is because I think John knows this. He clearly can't cite his sources accurately, and he clearly doesn't understand how science works, but he doesn't seem to care. He simultaneously appeals to the authority of science while also smearing the authority of science. Why? I think it's because he's trying to look smart. I largely want to point out the bad science going on here, but we can't and shouldn't ignore the motivations. John is the founder of MFR, and he's venerated as a guru in this space. And quite frankly, I think he's let that get to his head. Honestly, how could it not? He presents myofascial release as basically a magical fix for all that ails you. If his treatment that he somehow intuited one day overturns the foundation of medicine, that really would make him an enlightened teacher. If you're ignorant to all the misinformation and incorrect citations, he might seem like a genius, especially if conventional medicine hasn't helped you and his method has. When a particular treatment or modality is centered around one person, I automatically side-eye that. It's my opinion that myofascial release has a cult of personality problem. While cult of personality is just a turn of phrase and one that I do think applies here, I generally want to be careful throwing around the word cult. Cults and high-pressure groups are dangerous, and it's unfortunately difficult to define and identify them. A lot of people turn to Stephen Hassan's BITE model to determine if something is a cult, but I think there are times where people even use that a little too liberally. Plenty of groups check off some of the points on that model without being harmful or without being as harmful as a real cult. But I'm not going to protest too much because I think the BITE model is really helpful for spotting red flags, and the flags are waving.
Channel 3 and Unwinding.
There are a couple of aspects of myofascial release that I haven't mentioned yet, but they're the ones that concern me the most. You may remember what sent me down this path in the first place was Linda Ann Kahn's claim that emotional trauma was stored in the fascia.
We're going to look how trauma is stored in this extracellular matrix, and we're going to explore the extracellular matrix, which is part of the fascia. My teacher, John Barnes, has a lot to say about this, and when you have myofascial release sessions, that you can actually see and witness this release of the trauma that has been in the tissue for sometimes for years and years and years.
Originally, I attributed that claim to people like Bessel van der Kolk or Stephen Porges, since their theories are quite similar. And yes, Linda Ann does mention Stephen Porges, but what I didn't realize was that she didn't just get that theory from him. It also comes explicitly from John Barnes himself.
Society told us never to let go, as if it was some kind of a bad thing. And so it brings up a lot of fear. You and I were also taught not to ever express our fear, to dampen it down, to deny it. And when so doing, what we didn't realize was we were solidifying the ground substance of the fascial system, which can turn into physical restrictions, that can turn into physiological distress, pain, headaches, fibromyalgia, all these different labels that we're given for that, you know. So the more we can allow ourselves to feel naturally, the more capable we become of not only tapping into intuition, but healing. You have to feel to heal.
That's our primary communication system, but our system has to be fluid to project those photons, those vibrations of light that we call communication. When we go through trauma, physical or emotional, the vibration changes. That changes the ground substance from fluid to more viscous state. Mm-hmm. And if that's allowed to go on for too long, it solidifies into crushing pressure that starts to produce effects we call symptoms. But healthcare just looked at symptoms, the tip of the iceberg.
And I originally defended him, right? I didn't love that he claimed MFR could help with emotional trauma because of the relaxing environment, but that's not nearly as harmful a claim as Linda Ann's. But when I listened to him speak, I realized that description on his website is, in my opinion, very dishonest. Over and over again, John states that emotional trauma can cause fascial restrictions and that you can literally physically release them with this treatment, and thereby you can also release the emotional trauma. And his reasoning behind that is basically, if you undergo a traumatic event, whether it be physical or emotional, your body subconsciously develops a holding or bracing pattern.
Not too many therapists are aware of what I call tissue memory, or subconscious holding patterns, which is really the same thing. Mm-hmm. In fact, that's the huge fallacy in traditional healthcare, ignoring the mind and subconscious holding patterns that develop from protection when we're injured. If you don't eradicate them, it doesn't matter what you do, it's not going to hold. Mm-hmm. Mind rules, it's as simple as that. But in healthcare, of course, the mind was ignored for some absurd reason.
Mm-hmm. He says your fascia subconsciously tightens into that traumatized state, and you need to be placed back into that original state in order to release it. And besides the fact that that is all complete and utter speculation, not backed up by any kind of evidence, how damaging is that claim? This is a point I made in my lipedema video, where I said that it was incredibly harmful that Linda Ann would tell people that their chronic pain might be caused by emotional trauma. Well, here's John Barnes doing the exact same thing. Once again, I do believe psychosomatic pain exists. It's real, it's incredibly difficult to deal with. But there's a huge difference between going to a mental health professional to help unpack and cope with your issues, and a guy saying, you've got trauma in your fascia and you need to stretch it out. It's kind of the opposite of how a mental health professional would treat psychosomatic symptoms. Heal the mind to help heal the body. Myofascial release attempts to heal the body to heal the mind. John and his followers claim that MFR can heal emotional trauma or physical trauma if the client's subconscious takes over and moves their body in intuitive healing ways. This process is called unwinding.
What's interesting in our practice is when we never try to unwind anybody. We never tell people what to think or what to feel. We treat the fascia, let the body and mind spontaneously express itself. But people that have never even heard of yoga or don't even believe in yoga, doctors, lawyers, engineers, mm-hmm. The linear type people, they'll go into these spontaneous unwindings and achieve the classic yogi positions mm-hmm. that they never heard of before.
Right.
So they're sort of ingrained in us somehow.
In-group vocabulary like this isn't exclusive to cults, but it does feel like a red flag to me, especially in the context of emotional trauma, and especially considering the spiritual aspect.
So she went into unwinding, she went back into being in her mother's belly. Memories that, I think we all have memories there too, that's something else to consider. Because we've had a lot of people that when they returned to the womb, they remember their mother and father fighting with the feelings of not being wanted. They're born unloved and unwanted, and they struggle with that for years until they get treated.
Yeah, a lot of mothers were anesthetized, and then of course the baby was anesthetized too.
Ah, yeah.
So we see that a lot, and then sometimes you'll feel the anesthesia, even though the birth was 10 or 20, 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. You'll feel the smell of anesthesia pouring out of their mouth or off their skin. Mm-hmm. It's pretty wild, you know. We've had a lot of people that have red marks show up around their neck where the umbilical cord had gotten stuck, choked the child.
Unwinding doesn't happen every time someone undergoes MFR, but from what I can tell, it's kind of something everyone wants to experience. It's kind of this elusive, deep inner healing that someone can only achieve if they let go and allow it to happen. And it only can happen if the client's mind moves out of channel 5 and into channel 3. These are, yet again, special in-group vocabulary words from John.
So speaking of logical versus intuition, why don't you go ahead and explain to everyone, especially those who have never heard this before, about channel 3 and channel 5. How did that start? What does that mean?
Our whole education was based on intellect, and that's what I call channel 5, our rational intellectual side. Channel 3 is our intuitive, instinctive side. That's the healing zone. It's not about thinking about things. It's not trying making things happen. That's not what happens. Our mind body is capable of healing ourselves. That's what we're tuning into here with the therapist help.
These unwinding experiences can be extremely varied. It's kind of John Barnes' point. Everyone has different symptoms and everyone needs to heal in different ways. Unwinding can look like simple stretching, or it can look something like an exorcism. But the idea is the client should be intuitive, letting their subconscious take over and move them in ways that their conscious brain probably wouldn't. John theorizes that unwinding can lead people into uncovering past traumas and resolving them.
I'll share this quick story just from what you were saying about, this was in my intensive from 20 years ago, and I was having migraine headaches at the time. I had this, again, started to move off the table to unwinding type situation, and I had this deep sense of just not wanting to come here, like to the earth, and my arm was doing some strange thing, and this was all, still pretty new to me, the unwinding piece of it anyway, and I just kept feeling like just this grieving of having to come here to, it didn't make any sense to me. But you, after that session, picked up, you said, you know anything about your birth? Like, I didn't say anything to you about what was going on in my head. And what I was doing, it must have looked like a birthing type of experience. And I said, I really don't. So you said, you might ask your mom about that when you get a chance, see if she remembers anything. So I got off of the table and I was getting dressed. I looked in the mirror and there was a big red mark in the middle of my forehead. Right? I asked my mom, do you remember anything about my birth? And she said, well, back then they knocked us out, so I don't really remember that much, but I know that they had a hard time getting you out and they had to use forceps. And they got them on your head the wrong direction because you had a red mark in the middle of your forehead for about a month after you were born. There in your baby pictures. Isn't that amazing? And she said, your shoulder got stuck, which is why they used the forceps. And so hence the sensation I had with that arm during the treatment.
This is probably because I'm an unenlightened Channel 5 simpleton, but I could think of some alternative explanations for those experiences. The first and I think most likely explanation is that people are having an ideomotor response. This is an extremely common psychological phenomenon where people move subconsciously. Most of the time, ideomotor responses are small muscular reactions so slight that the person doesn't even notice them. The ideomotor response can account for things like pendulums, dowsing rods, or even the movement of a planchette on a Ouija board. But other times, the ideomotor response can be more noticeable, like with things like automatic writing, hypnosis, and I think probably exorcisms. And when you layer things like spirituality and healing on top of the ideomotor phenomenon, it can even amplify the response. If someone thinks they've attained an enlightened state, especially if a figure of authority is telling them that's the case, they're more likely to have the response, and they're more likely to believe what the leader says about it is true. John is potentially reframing people's real experiences into something I think they're probably not, or even giving them false memories of things they didn't experience. I'm sure someone could experience psychosomatic pain because of trauma, but John says the pain comes from physical fascial restrictions that ever so conveniently can't be tested, and ever so conveniently, he's the only one who's figured out how to fix them. My first question, as always, is, how do you know? He doesn't. My second question is, how does someone change the channel? John never really lays out any instructions. I guess we're supposed to intuit that like everything else. How would you even know you're actually in channel 3? Where's channel 4? What happened to 1 and 2? Is channel 5 the default, or are there people walking around in channel 3 all the time? I have a feeling John would probably hate those questions. That's the left brain talking. Logical thinking is obviously incredibly important, And John does pay lip service to that, but then he claims it gets in the way of healing physical and emotional traumas. Training people to let go of logic and embrace their intuition to achieve true healing sounds really dangerous, but it also sounds like yet another way in which MFR is unfalsifiable. If MFR didn't work for you, maybe it's your fault because you couldn't reach channel 3. And how could you prove you did or didn't? It's an entirely abstract concept. I listened to a podcast interview John did with a massage therapist whose business is called Rebel Massage, Match Made in Heaven. This whole interview was about channel 3 and channel 5.
When it comes to his own healthcare and our collective healthcare, John holds that our ability to live in channel 3 helps us to observe ourselves in channel 5, and what can happen from there is spectacular.
You think about when you're traumatized. One of the examples I give is, let's say you're walking across the street, you see a car coming at you. You turn toward the car, maybe your hands are, you get hit by the car. Our feeling intelligence, which is channel 3, somehow leaves your body. Now, you're usually injured in motion, so I fall to the ground, there's another position space, and more leaves. Damn car runs over me. That's a big one, you know. So it turns out that this survival mechanism, when something has gotten too intense for us, too painful, too scary, the feeling intelligence leaves your body to numb you out. So that no other form of healthcare pays any attention to that. It turns out that your subconscious, your channel 3, your mind, whatever you choose to call it, is capable of healing yourself. So with the help of the therapist, what we do is we take gravity out of the system very lightly. And it's about trust. If the patient trusts you, and if the therapist is in channel 3, they trust you. They can feel it on the subconscious level because they're being touched in a way they've never been touched before, and it feels very safe. As they take their brakes off, which is channel 5, the body spontaneously starts to move. It's the most amazing thing. And somehow the body will find positions of past trauma. When you hit these positions of past trauma, all the pain, all the fear that happened at the moment of trauma come billowing forth from the subconscious, and it connects with the conscious mind. That's where authentic healing commences.
John loves the phrase, "it turns out." He uses it all the time. It's a great way to offload a huge claim onto someone else. How did he learn it turned out to be the case? We'll never know. Probably because it would turn out that all of this just came from John's own mind.
It is clear that John Barnes lives an authentic life dropped into his channel 3. His passion for myofascial release and its profound effect on how we heal is contagious.
Well, that at least answers one of my questions. There is someone who walks around in channel 3 all the time. Honestly, I'm not surprised John is apparently never in the channel associated with logic and intellect. Something that's really important to note is that not every myofascial release experience is like this. Plenty of practitioners promote MFR for run-of-the-mill pain, like John's back, or that ankle example I gave a while ago. I think that's what allows MFR to kind of fly under the radar. There's a very rational-looking surface level, but a lot of people don't realize that there's this other aspect beneath that. This whole investigation was like peeling back the layers of an onion. First, I visited the website, which at first glance seemed normal, and I feel like that was intentional. If you open with channel 3 and channel 5 and unwinding your emotional trauma, you're probably going to scare some people away. When I moved on to the interviews, they were obviously a lot of nonsense to me, but like I said, I think most of the people watching these are primed to accept the things that are a little more kooky. And then I found out John Barnes had written some books. It's time to finally cut to the center of this stinky onion.
John Barnes wrote a stinky book.
John Barnes actually wrote 2 books, but I only read one of them, so I can't vouch for the stinkiness of the other. The first book he wrote is called Myofascial Release: The Search for Excellence. It was published in 1990, and it was supposed to be like a technical guide on how to do MFR. I've watched instructional videos and listened to him talk about how it's done, so I figured it wasn't necessary for me to read that book. But the second book, published in 2000, is called Healing Ancient Wounds: The Renegade's Wisdom. Now, how could I resist a title like that? This book was supposed to be more of a personal story, more about John himself and how he developed MFR over the years. Also, if you'd like to read it yourself, you can borrow it for free on the Internet Archive. Let's start at the beginning, where he tells the story of how he injured his back at the gym. A lightning bolt of pain ripped through my body. I lay there stunned. It seemed as if I had slipped into another level of consciousness, a very deep level. It felt like a time warp, a timeless, spaceless dimension, floating and soaring, and then a sense of flow. I felt like I was out of my body. Gradually I became aware of my body, but only the upper half, as if there were no lower half. Then I seemed to slip into another deeper dimension of consciousness. Or did it slip into me? A voice with great authority and wisdom came thundering through me.
You must bring your awareness back to your body now.
Why? I asked.
You will need all of your awareness, willpower, and courage to handle the responsibilities that lie before you.
What responsibilities? I asked.
They will unfold.
I can't feel my legs.
Move them.
I can't.
You must focus. This trauma that has just happened to you was initiated eons ago and is now being manifested in your life.
My legs feel numb.
Good. That means your awareness is returning. This trauma will significantly change your life forever.
Who are you? Your voice sounds and feels so familiar.
I am called the Ancient Warrior. I am your guide. I have been with you all of your life. You have thought of me as your intuition until you allowed your schooling to teach you that intuition was not logical. Now move your legs.
It's really starting to hurt.
The pain will be intense. Feel it. The intensity will awaken you.
I am awake.
Barely. It is time for you to be fully aware and move into your power. Your suffering will be the catalyst that awakens you to a deeper reality and will initiate a chain reaction that will affect the lives of millions of people. Move your legs.
Did that story sound a little different that time? Alright, yeah, so this is clearly not a technical guide. The synopsis of this book is John F. Barnes, PT, world-renowned therapist, author, visionary, and authority on myofascial release, weaves a fascinating story taking you into his highly charged and intriguing world of authentic healing. This enjoyable and important new book, Healing Ancient Wounds, The Renegade's Wisdom, explores the intricacies of intuitive awareness and the dynamic mind-body healing principles of myofascial release. Having read the book, I take issue with that description, mostly with the word enjoyable, but also with the word weaves. A basket woven with the same skill as John Barnes' storytelling would be a pile of wicker strips. This is not a story. It is random anecdotes interspersed with vaguely related and highly suspect testimonials. I'll be honest with you, I just skimmed most of the testimonials because I feel like they comprise like 2/3 of this book, and I came here to read John's words, not other people's. From what I can tell, they're mostly clients singing John's praises for healing them, or therapists singing John's praises for teaching them to heal other people. And they're also, shall we say, similarly phrased. At one point during our work in Sedona, I was telling John that our patients will sometimes call us miracle workers, and John's comment was, maybe you are. Maybe we are. Whatever we label it, it sure feels right, and it sure feels good. I would like to end by saying that I'm grateful to John and his staff for all of their efforts and willingness to share themselves with my wife and with me. You certainly have the ability to help people find meaning in their lives. Impressions of John? John Barnes strikes me as a person like Copernicus or Leonardo da Vinci. He is a man with ideas that buck the establishment. He sees a new way of explaining the phenomena he encounters and is not afraid to talk about it. This type of person tends to create a following. John has been given a rare and wonderful gift by the universe, which we are so privileged to share in. I am automatically skeptical of anything that throws out anecdotal evidence and testimonials like this, because it usually means that's all they've got. But let's jump back to the elephant in the room, which is that this book is completely insane. I will say I wasn't surprised that it was insane, but I was surprised by how insane. I mention my favorite podcast, Ono, Ross, and Carrie, every 5 seconds because it really played a pivotal role in my life, teaching me how to be an open-minded skeptic and how to do proper research. And one of the things I learned from them is that if you find something crazy and you really want to see how deep the crazy goes, read the book. Books are where people like John Barnes really release their inhibitions, feel the rain on their skin. Why? Because a book like this is a commitment, and it's one that not many people will make. Honestly, the type of person who would listen to John Barnes speak and think, yes, more of that please, is the type of person who is probably already open to this level of crazy. Well, there's that type, and there's the type with whatever neurosis I've got. John can say my intuition led me to create this massage technique, and that sounds a little kooky, but I think a lot of people would be willing to buy it. Every treatment that exists started with somebody saying, I don't know, let's try this. But to say out loud in an online interview that it was actually inspired by the booming voice of the ancient warrior, yeah, that's probably not gonna happen. He's gotta make sure you're really in before you hear that story. The ancient warrior is such an interesting character in this book. And yes, it is a character. Whenever we see bold italicized text, we're supposed to understand it as the ancient warrior, even if John doesn't specify that. And I think this is a very clever literary device. John calls the ancient warrior his intuition from time to time, but he still refers to it as this separate entity with more wisdom than he has. In this book, John continually questions the ancient warrior's instructions and is scolded for it. And I think that does two things. It makes John seem just as rational and skeptical as a potential reader of this book, and it also offloads all of his beliefs onto a separate being than himself. He didn't come up with this stuff, it was just this ethereal being that spoke to him. He just took a chance on it and found out that it worked, much like his clients should do. This book also demonstrates that John's understanding of science is somehow even worse than I thought. Psychologists have been telling us for years that we only utilize about 10% of our brain. I believe this 10% is our linear, logical, intellectual side. The other 90% of who we are, our essence, the creative, intuitive, feeling, and wise aspect, has been ignored and even ridiculed in our education. Nope. We use all of our brains. The 10% myth is very popular, but very wrong. Neuroscientists estimate that your mind-body wisdom's database outperforms the intellectual linear side on an order exceeding 10 million to 1. Citation needed. He does use citations in this book, but curiously there are none here. I wonder why. For years, I have taught that the fascia on the microscopic level is actually a three-dimensional web of tiny hollow tubules filled with fluid, which carries information. This information in the form of thermal, electromagnetic, and mechanical energy is transmitted to all aspects of the mind-body complex via myofascial release for healing on the deepest level. Source? Just trust me. What do fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic pain, headaches, pelvic/menstrual pain, and dysfunction and PMS have in common? These are simply different labels of a common denominator, unrecognized myofascial restrictions, which do not show up on any of the standard tests that are now performed, nor have most health professionals been taught how to recognize them. Ancient Wounds is absolutely chock full of claims with dubious or non-existent sources. I should have made a bingo card for this book because he really crossed off every pseudoscientific cliche there is. He'll reference scientists only when he needs to sound credible, but then the rest of the time they're ignorant. Always a reference to quantum physics. And as always, an Albert Einstein misquote. None of this was surprising to me. But what was surprising were all of the spiritual claims. He kind of hints at this stuff in the interviews, but only subtly, referring to love as healing, referring to wisdom as this innate thing that exists in all of us. The Channel 3 stuff feels pretty spiritual to me, but an argument could be made that it's not. John never really comes right out and talks about faith or God, but by the end of this book he sure does. I realize I have been blessed. I have been guided by a higher power, God. I have trained a multitude of therapists and physicians who are healing millions of people with myofascial release, and nobody has ever been injured, so it certainly is not the work of the devil. My intuition, the ancient one, has a strong loving presence. God may work in strange and mysterious ways, but however it may unfold, it always produces a loving and positive result. Some have called this innate intelligence, the wisdom of the body. Still others have called it God. Whatever word you are most comfortable calling this power and wisdom, the bottom line is that this energy/information flows through the ground substance and microtubules of the fascial system. Where does the energy come from? My experience has led me to believe that we are like beautiful luminescent dewdrops in the sea. As our awareness increases, we see that we are not only a dewdrop, but also the sea. I perceive the sea as God. You may be more comfortable labeling the sea another name. Whatever label you believe in, there is an infinite vast sea of vibrations, love and light. A loving force that helps, guides, and gives us life and healing energy. Obviously, this isn't a negative for everyone, but for me, if a therapy is centered around any kind of faith or spirituality, I'm out. And there are multiple reasons for that. Number one, it just doesn't apply to me. And number two, it automatically becomes unfalsifiable. I keep trotting out the word unfalsifiable with myofascial release because it keeps being true for different reasons. It relies on intuition on the part of the practitioner, which we can't quantify. It relies on the intuition on the part of the patient, which we can't quantify. And if it also relies on faith or spirituality, we can't quantify that either. Science cannot say whether or not a spiritual realm exists. It doesn't have access to that. All science has access to is the natural world as it can be perceived and tested. Does that mean John's spiritual claims are wrong? Not necessarily. I would say that they're just very unlikely and very untestable. And that really worries me when we're talking about people's health. John's description of MFR sounds pretty much like faith healing to me. It's especially concerning since John positions MFR over conventional medicine. I think he'd probably try to refute that since he has said medicine is useful for emergency situations. But this book showed me that John's definition of an emergency is quite a bit different than most people's. He tells a story about getting bitten by a deadly brown recluse spider, and he treats going to the hospital as like a fate worse than death. The Poison Control Center said that I had been bitten by a brown recluse spider. They said it was one of the worst and most dangerous of spider bites, close to the impact of a rattlesnake. They said people could die from the recluse bite. There is no antidote. If I got worse, I was told to go to the emergency room, and there I'd be put on intravenous medications to try to save my life. I decided to tough it out. There really was no alternative anyway. John says he suffered from that spider bite for like a year, and he relied on Unwinding and a chiropractor to heal him. Great example for your patients, John. Actually, the MFR therapist and the chiropractor helped, but they didn't fully heal him. Who did? The ancient warrior, of course. I responded to an urge to stretch and then began to spontaneously unwind. As my mind-body continued to unwind, I felt myself slipping into a swirling darkness. I became aware of a deep fear emanating from a darkness in my heart. I began to swirl in a vortex of energy, into the crushing pain and into the fear.
Breathe. Feel it deeply.
The ancient warrior came to me and whispered to me in a very gentle way.
Renegade, it is time to mend your broken heart. Your little boy so grieves for his father. Go back to the time when you were young and see yourself at the father and son dinner held annually at your grade school. You were the only boy there without a father. Remember and feel how crushed you were. You felt so alone. Feel the pain of your broken heart.
I started to sob from the depths of my being. My body was racked in pain, and it felt like my heart was going to burst. I was back in time as a little boy at the father and son dinner. As I looked around at all the other boys with their fathers, I felt so alone, so hurt. I missed him so much. My heart was truly broken. The Ancient One took me, the adult, by the hand, and we put our arms around my little boy and encouraged him to feel and cry. We reassured him that he was loved and that my father was fine. We asked my little boy to open his heart and send my father and mother love and light. We sent love and light to let them go and be free. We reassured each other that we would always love each other and are together in our hearts. My heart softened and the pain left. I could feel my essence returning and filling my body. I felt present again. Does anyone else feel like the Ancient Warrior is starting to seem like a surrogate? Never mind, we don't have time to unpack all of that. What's most bizarre to me about this story is that John knows full well that the spider bite is what caused his symptoms, yet the only way he could resolve them is by resolving a seemingly unrelated childhood trauma. How on earth does he know those things are connected? Well, I could ask that for most of the things he says in this book. From a Q&A for therapists, when should you lift them? Remember that you're not lifting them, you are just neutralizing the effects of gravity on their system, and they will become lighter and float up. If you are lifting them, then back off, because that will be your signal that you are not doing the right thing. I believe that they leave their body during a still point. What I mean by that is I believe the mind, the energy body, has density and mass, and that's what you feel leave the body. That's why the body gets lighter. It goes out to another dimension and reorganizes. It then comes back through the silver cord and the body gets heavier again. The energy comes back in. What are the principles of off-the-body energy work? There are principles to it that are similar to myofascial release. You learn to focus your light energy hand, not just your physical hand, to hook into their energy. Your physical hand is there, but your light energy hand is actually doing the work, acting like a magnet and starting to draw the energy like a weed. Can John prove there is such a thing as an energy body? No. Much like myofascial restrictions, that is not something that is testable. How convenient. Then John brings up something extremely controversial and says that basically unwinding can result in you seeing your past life experiences. Past life experiences really may be no more than your mind's way of representing a lesson to you in symbolic form, for that is the way your right brain works, via stories, pictures, colors, feelings, and that type of thing. Okay, so this complicates things. John says we can't determine if someone else's experiences are true or false. That leaves room for unwinding to not necessarily always reveal real experiences, but also reveal metaphorical experiences to help people deal with their problems more abstractly. Do I still have a problem with that? Personally, yes. I don't love that the practitioner is supposed to just encourage the patient into thinking these experiences could be real. The whole point of unwinding is to put people in an altered state of mind. People are very creative, especially on a subconscious level. I think these past life experiences could be kind of like dreams. Brains are just weird. It doesn't have to be that deep. But it seems like John is willing to allow that past life experiences could be useful to the person experiencing them, even if we don't believe they're real. Like he says, regardless of what we believe, it's not up to us to be judgmental and force our belief system on somebody else. Wait. In any event, I have experienced what appears to be my own past life. Where did the we go, John? I love how he identified himself with the skeptic and then turned right around and said, anyway, I've had past life experiences. By the way, that tiny ounce of skepticism we saw earlier on the page will be the last time we see that. Everything else is really off the rails from here. So let's go over his past life experiences, shall we? I entered the instructor's room. The lights were dim and we decided the order in which we would be treated. I would go last. Their treatments went well, but I felt unusually tired. They suggested that I lie on the bed. One therapist cradled the back of my head. The other 3 touched my torso and legs. I quieted myself and nothing happened for a while. I told myself mentally that even if nothing happened, this felt soothing. Eventually, a very subtle, slow, spontaneous motion began in my body. I felt like I was being transported back in time. I went deeper and deeper, and I became aware that my motions were speeding up, and I could feel a rumble deep in my belly. A charge of energy was quickly building momentum. The rumble in my belly started to feel like a freight train. I exploded and was now airborne, fighting powerfully, throwing all 4 people around like little sticks. I was furious. They leapt on me and held me down in a spread eagle position, with each one pinning my limbs down with all their weight. My fury went beyond anything I had experienced before. The spread eagle position and the feel of their weight on me catapulted me into another time. I saw mountains in the background. It was dusk, and I had been lassoed and pulled off my horse. I was caught. I couldn't believe it. I was caught. I was a Native American, glistening with sweat, and I could smell the white man. I hated the smell of white men. They had me spread eagle and were beating me. The rumble in my belly escalated into a frightening power that exploded in me. I roared, throwing all 4 into the air. The sound of lamps crashing and therapists falling on me brought me back into present time. Why? Why is it always Native Americans? Would you believe I wrote that little bit in the intro about Linda Ann's spiritual Egypt and co-opting other cultures before I even read this part of the book? I really should have made a bingo card. We decided to lie on the floor and quiet ourselves. A vision that was implied by the ancient warrior years before began to play in my mind's eye. I saw hordes of white men with guns streaming across the prairie. I saw that if we didn't do something, my people would be killed. My ideas were eventually rejected and I was causing too much turmoil. I felt that it was best to leave the tribe with a few trusted friends to see what I could do on my own. I found it impossible to change the minds of those interested in the status quo. I was now called the renegade, and the only one who stayed with the tribe but knew of my whereabouts was my wife. I started to loot the white men's storehouses for guns and ammunition. Over time I gained quite a following with many of the braves from different tribes who were willing to fight and defend our tribes. Our successes in stealing guns began to threaten the white men. As the leader, they saw me as a threat, and they started to hunt for the renegade. A few weeks later, I asked some of my therapists to treat me, and it turned into an unwinding, and the story continued. I, the renegade, was fighting with these men, and one hit me on the head and knocked me out. As I awoke, I was tied to the back of a horse being dragged through a stream. They were trying to drown me. Water was filling my lungs, and I was gasping for air and choking, and then everything went dark. I lay still and the unwinding finished. I was distraught. I interpreted this as the end. I had died. I had lost my fight. I had let my people down. The unwinding started, and I returned to the darkness as I lay in the creek. I was very still. The two therapists stood over me as I lay on my back. All of a sudden, I saw my arm burst out of the water and grab the white man's neck. I then threw a punch and hit the other, knocking them down. I was alive. I had pretended to be dead. I had fooled them. This story tells me quite a bit about John himself. And I think that was the intention, but the conclusion I drew was probably different than the one I was supposed to. So this was clearly where we got the renegade part of the title of this book. You may also like to know that after this, the ancient warrior starts referring to John as renegade. There is a theme throughout this book that he is just the wisest person alive. But this was all kind of thrust upon him. He didn't ask for the ancient warrior to give him these messages. He didn't ask for a past life as this powerful and clever Native American warrior. He just happens to be really cool and smart and enlightened. Once again, I think this is a sales tactic. Maybe John really experienced these things. I'm inclined to be doubtful of that, but who knows? Either way, even if he did experience these things, I think it's very interesting how he chose to frame them in this book. He aligns himself with science when it's convenient, but then backtracks. He aligns himself with skeptics when it's convenient, and then backtracks. There was another time the renegade came up, but this time was a little different. A funny thing happened to me a few months after that. A friend of mine who is a psychiatrist invited me to a workshop. It was being given by a psychic who is affiliated with the Edgar Cayce Foundation and who had decided to come out of the closet in this workshop. I don't know what he means by that. The problem was that I had been working for 2 months straight with no days off, and the weekend of the workshop was the first weekend that I had to rest. My friend was very excited, and I didn't want to let him down, so I went. It was a small group of 10 people. Except for my friend, I didn't know anyone. I liked the speaker, he was very articulate and seemed solid, but I found myself grumbling to myself that this was very rudimentary, and here it was, my only weekend off, and I'm sitting here listening to concepts that I am very familiar with. All of a sudden, the ancient warrior said,
"Stop it. A master always looks at each situation as a fresh moment, ripe with opportunity."
So I quieted down as I heard the speaker say, "Pick someone you don't know, pair up and sit facing each other." A young lady of about 21, whom I'd never met before, got up and asked if she could be my partner. I agreed. The instructor asked us to quiet our minds, pull our energy back, and sit there in silence. After about 5 minutes, I felt jolts go through my body, and my partner screamed. The instructor ran over and asked her what happened. She said she didn't know. She said we started to quiet down and relax, and all of a sudden, my partner, she pointed to me, turned into a shimmering Indian with white owl feathers on his head. He jumped off a cliff and hit and killed a man with a hatchet, and then he transformed into a huge cat which pounced at me. Absolutely not. That did not happen. I try to tread carefully with my claims most of the time, but I'm at my limit. This is not true. There's an alarming amount of fetishization of Native Americans in this book. It is crazy. You have this renegade story, and then you have another story about this huge, strong, stoic Native American patient that John has, who also coincidentally knows about the ancient warrior and leaving your body and all that, because his grandfather, a shaman, taught him. And if you're not American, you might not get the connotation, but there's a stereotype of Native Americans being wiser and more mystical than other cultures. And it feels to me like John is trying to align himself with that. He's just a white guy, but somehow he is intuitive enough to come to this ancient practice himself. If this story is even true, and, well, there's a troubling story about a woman unwinding back to the year 1703 and narrowly escaping being assaulted, and that's why she distrusts men and lacks intimacy with her husband. The MFR fixed all of that, of course, and that's a recurring theme in this book and in MFR as a whole. It targets women, and I use the word targets intentionally. There are plenty of male patients and testimonials in this book, but there's a whole chapter called Reclaiming the Feminine Essence, and it's all about specifically female patients and how MFR was able to cure their pelvic pain and pregnancy complications and improve their sex lives. And he emphasizes, or lets the testimonials emphasize, that this was all without drugs or surgery. These patients say their doctors told them their symptoms were all in their heads. I'm sure that probably happened, but that's somehow different than John telling them they have these symptoms because they haven't released their emotional trauma. He also specifically names fibromyalgia, which overwhelmingly affects women. We don't really know what causes fibromyalgia. But John can fix that too. It's probably all your fault because of your unresolved trauma. There's one testimonial where John performs MFR on a woman's jaw. It pops, she lets out a loud noise, and then she allegedly says, "My jaw feels perfect and my body feels great. It's as if I have rediscovered my voice. Interesting how not voicing my truths have resulted in a messed up jaw." John claims to want to help people, but then it turns into what feels like victim blaming. It's your fault you have jaw pain because you won't speak your truths. It's your fault you have fibromyalgia because you haven't released your fear. It couldn't be that existing as a woman gave you a rational fear of men. It must be that you need to release your trauma from 1703. John discovers in a past life he was a mastodon. This book is exhausting. Oh, this one's fun. He tells a story about a skeptical doctor who he was able to turn into a believer. I was in Kauai, Hawaii a number of years ago, and I was doing a myofascial release seminar series there, and a physician showed up. He was a local doctor, an emergency room and family physician. He had had some friends who were therapists, and they had told him about the course, so he decided to take it. The first morning at the Myofascial Release Unwinding seminar, I asked for a volunteer, and he came up on the stage. He turned to the audience and said, "Well, I'm a total skeptic." I put my hands on his back and head, and in about 30 seconds he's upside down with his butt in the air, shaking violently and screaming his head off. Finally, he collapsed in a sweaty heap and he said, "Wow, you know what that reproduced for me? I hit a high voltage line on a surfboard and was almost electrocuted 8 months ago. I've had horrible shoulder pain and I haven't been able to raise my arm since then." He then raised his arms through a full range of motion and said, "The pain is gone. Well, I guess I'm not a skeptic anymore." I'm sure that happened. In conclusion, I struggle to believe anything in this book is true, and to say I'm extremely skeptical of John Barnes is an understatement. It worries me that John has somehow fooled so many people into thinking he's a credible source. I honestly can't even tell if he buys his own hype or if this is all purposefully constructed. I can see parallels between the person John presents himself to be and leaders of other cult-like spiritual groups. There's a frightening amount of parallels between John and someone like L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology. He also presented himself as wise and worldly and spiritually enlightened, but when you actually dig into the person he was, all of that seems to be fabricated. And much like Scientology, the deeper you go into MFR, the crazier it gets. Maybe that sounds like an extreme comparison, given Scientology's reputation, but several groups borrowed from Scientology in the 50s and 60s. L. Ron Hubbard borrowed from a lot of other things too. Some of those beliefs were just floating around in the zeitgeist of fringe science and spirituality at the time, even if they weren't directly associated with Scientology. The parallels don't shock me, considering myofascial release also started in the 1960s, which makes it even funnier that John Barnes acts like he has some kind of special wisdom. Yeah, you and every other enlightened leader. People literally fawn over John Barnes and treat him like a guru. A lot of his followers accept what he says as gospel, but his solution to skeptics is not and cannot always be to flip them upside down and spontaneously unwind them. He does often say in interviews that he has critics, although I've noticed he never really says what they critique him for. He just vaguely alludes to them being too left-brained and closed-minded to accept his methods. Fair enough. I mean, I would say by now my mind has closed to a lot of this, and John would definitely call me left-brained or in Channel 5. But like I mentioned before, not all of MFR is spiritual. Some practitioners purely rely on the mechanical aspect, like any other form of physical therapy. So I wondered, what happens if there's skepticism from the in-group?
Okay, maybe this is a cult.
During my research, I stumbled upon a YouTube video by a channel called Renegade Therapies, and I was immediately intrigued by the title, Why I Walked Out of John F. Barnes' Myofascial Release Seminars. This wasn't the first time I'd seen unrest from within MFR. Months and months ago, while I was still in the middle of my lipedema investigation, I did look into MFR a little bit. Sure, there were plenty of people singing its praises, but I also kept coming across forums and Reddit threads by massage therapists who said they liked myofascial release but warned people to stay far away from John Barnes. And yes, some of them went so far as to refer to his following as a cult. That's when I knew I needed to file this away for a later project. The Renegade Therapies channel is run by a massage therapist named Joel Mitchell, and I found his story extremely concerning and compelling. He starts the video still praising the MFR technique. He says the problem lies with John and the inner circle.
First, I'll start off by saying that If you come across this video as a patient seeking a John F. Barnes myofascial release therapist and you're interested in what it can do for your pain and dysfunction, go for it. Those therapists are highly trained, extremely passionate, and very good at what they do, very intuitive. Now, if you walk into their clinic and you see like a shrine dedicated to John Barnes, I'd probably turn around, but other than that, you're totally good. Because you see, when a master or a guru keeps those closest to him, who worship him the most, who would never dare question him, they become like this ego feeding machine, and that is a very difficult temptation, I think, to resist. And I think that leads to a very closed-minded belief that your process, your timing, and your way is the only way of doing things. And that's because that's what the people closest to you believe, or want you to believe.
Obviously, I wanted to know more, and the good news is that this video is labeled Part 1 of 2. Part 1 actually came out in January 2018, and Part 2 came out later that year, but it was actually just a pitch for his book where he goes much more in depth about his experience. In that video, he said you could get the book for free via an email sign up, but it doesn't seem like that works anymore. But you can still find the book for free online if you look it up. It's titled Radical Unwinding, Deep Healing, Cult Methods, and the Dark Arts. Alright, I'm on board. I was looking forward to hearing the other side, so to speak. Considering Joel still buys into the spiritual and emotional healing aspects of MFR, I figured I wouldn't agree with everything in this book, but I was okay with that. Anyone's work can be valuable even if we have different beliefs. What I found was, no offense, but I think Joel Mitchell is even more unhinged than John Barnes. Now hang on, let me add some qualifiers. I think Joel Mitchell comes across as, I don't know, unwell. The emotion I felt the most while reading this book was deep concern for his well-being, because the biggest problem that Joel had with John Barnes' MFR seminars was that they weren't wild enough. He places his focus on the importance of unwinding, which for him seems to be a way to get out his internal rage in ways that seem frightening. The next day, somebody unwound on stage with John during the first technique, and since I was ready to pop, I took it straight to John. I went up to him and said, "My solar plexus is about to explode, and I would like to be a volunteer for the next technique." He said, "Yeah, no problem. We have transverse plane techniques coming up." I replied with a simple thank you. It took longer than I had hoped. When he finally called me up on stage, I was restless as f*** as I tore off my clothes and threw them into the crowd. John responded by saying, "Underwear too," which was a brilliant and humorous response to a situation he obviously wasn't unfamiliar with. I waited for him to get so far as basic explanation and hand placement before I started to let go. My solar plexus contracted and my body was twisting, contorting, and self-adjusting with more power and accuracy than I've ever felt as I landed on all fours on the table. This was the embodiment of my rage, and my animal consciousness was becoming dominant. Rationality was limited. I then started to roar heavily while John tried to explain to the novice crowd that it was suppressed anger coming out of me. As I became extremely animalistic in all of my expressions, John took a few steps back and said, "Run out the door and take your power back." Since I was already an extremely empowered individual prior to walking through the door of that seminar, and feeling quite empowered in that moment, this statement did nothing for me. I didn't even respond to it. He said it again, "Run out the door and take your power back." Even with my limited rationality at the time, I was sensing that John was needing to get me out of the building due to the heavy nature of what I was displaying to this new crowd of therapists. There was a good portion of me that still had a grip, but unfortunately I was mostly a filthy animal in that moment. I jumped up, growled at John, and I'm pretty sure I growled at some random chick on my way out of the building. I think most unwinding experiences are supposed to return people to past physical or emotional traumas, but Joel's unwinding leads him to a lot of strange visions and spiritual states, including seeing a neon cat that is also somehow him, total oneness with Gaia herself, and even a Christ-like state at one point. Joel did give me a lot more perspective into what John Barnes' inner circle was like, at least from his perspective. He participated in a lot of what are called therapy for the therapist sessions with John and his followers, including a retreat to John's therapy center and even his own home in Sedona. These sessions are supposed to be educational, but also give the therapists more in-depth experiences of their own. It's a lot of unwinding and exploring trauma in a way that really concerns me. I've seen unwinding described as an elusive, energetic experience that doesn't seem to happen for everyone, but for these seminars, it almost seems like a requirement. Everyone is able to slip into Channel 3 seamlessly, or at least appear to. More on that later. I'm sorry to say I found a lot of Joel's book very hard to believe, but in a completely different way than John's book. John's book felt like it was constructed in a manipulative way, but I didn't get that impression from Joel's book. What I don't necessarily trust about Joel is his perception of what was going on. Obviously, I'm a skeptic, so I have different ideas about what these spiritual experiences might have been, but I'm not going to nitpick about that. Those are his experiences, and he's free to interpret them however he wants. My issue is that Joel likes to tell us a lot about what other people are thinking, and he largely bases that on vibes and vibes alone. I think we as human beings can pick up a lot of subtle body language and tone of voice indicators, but this goes way beyond that. A few of John's staff members were not fans of how I was representing Unwinding online. A big reason is childlike jealousy of the amount of attention I was receiving, laced with a "who does this guy think he is" kind of attitude. One of John's associates that he calls Bitch Boy made this clear, while the others were a bit more passive. My videos were also dangerous to them in a deeper sense. I was always alone, and I was doing things by myself and without their help. With that and other reasons they chose to not actively communicate, they just didn't like how I was representing Unwinding. To put it more simply, they just didn't like me. On my way out the door, I saw a therapist he calls the Scorpio, and I went up to her and said, "Unwinding starts tomorrow, and if you're going to keep coming at me, you better come at me with everything you've got." I said this in a serious but playful manner because to me this was most certainly a seriously playful experience. She became incredibly defensive in her posture, showing to me that she was guilty of something that had gone unspoken. As I approached the clinic on the first day, I said this simple prayer, "God, I'm going in, please stay close." And I walked in the door. While sitting down and filling out the paperwork, a woman slowly walked by and did a light, ever so soft touch on my knee while saying, "Hi Joel, I'm John's pet," real name changed. This chick was definitely coming for me. It was a very slick predatory move, and she was very much wanting to be the one to get me to break. She had the same energy and demeanor as the Scorpio down in Captiva, so instinctively my guard was up with her, but I'd give her a chance if she played it well enough. I was flattered by her come-on in the same way I'd be flattered by a girl flirting with me at a party when I was younger. It's a variation of the same behavior, but instead of my dick, she wanted my ego. I don't think those claims are particularly reliable. I mean, Joel is the author of this book. He has free reign to depict things in any way he likes and to depict himself in any way he likes. But even his own descriptions sound incredibly suspicious to me. But there were plenty of other things I do believe happened, and they are quite concerning. Actually, part of the reason I believe these things is because Joel himself didn't seem to have much of a problem with them. The therapist did an unwinding technique that involved getting dunked underwater in a way that seems similar to waterboarding. Joel thinks the guy who nearly drowned him did have ill intentions, but he says the technique is useful otherwise. There's something else called the slap technique, where they just slap you. They also did internal myofascial release, which is exactly what it sounds like, just use your imagination. All of that is just terrifying. A guru and his followers in a secluded location performing these extremely questionable techniques on people who paid an insane amount of money to be there. Hello? Part of the problem is that Joel comes into these exercises already combative. He seems to have a pre-existing belief that he's too intense for these people to handle. And I can't disagree. His unwinding experiences are pretty consistently aggressive and scary. He screams and growls and just in general behaves like a wild animal. And it's understandably very off-putting for instructors and the other therapists. He criticizes John and the other instructors for trying to tamp down on these extremely powerful healing experiences. And while he's coming at this from a very different angle than I am, I kind of see his point. If unwinding is supposed to get you into this deep state of wisdom and healing, couldn't it manifest the way Joel's does? If the instructors really did react to him in the way he describes by trying to get him to be calmer and more controlled, doesn't that go against everything that John stands for? He says to let go of your control, but not like that. In fact, John and his team took such issue with Joel's experiences that they started vague posting about him on Facebook. Joel included a screenshot in his book with the instructor's name censored because, like Joel said in his video, John lets his followers do his dirty work, allegedly. Tough love. A lot of questionable things have been going on lately, and we're going to put a stop to it. There's someone out there that has been putting videos on MFR Insight of his unwindings, which have been pseudo-unwindings and are giving the wrong message to patients, other therapists, and anyone else who is watching. Lately, your videos have been grotesque, disturbing, and utilizing foul language. This obviously is going to leave a very negative impression about myofascial release and your clients desperately needing help. In one of your recent videos, you said something about your pain can be resolved by unwinding to music. That is exactly what John says not to do. It is okay to play music, but be tuned into the rhythm of your patient, not the rhythm of the music. Do you realize your clients are looking at this? Are you trying to destroy your own practice? Are you trying to hurt MFR and yourself? If you continue to want to flagellate yourself, do so in private, no longer in public. As you know, we have recently had interactions with you and all of your unwindings were either with your brakes on or pseudo-unwindings. In a recent seminar, you purposely, I emphasize purposely, hit and injured one of our instructors. This is assault and is criminal activity. It is time for you to stop this abhorrent, dysfunctional, childish behavior and go inward to have the courage to face your fears so authentic healing can occur. Now, Joel refutes the assault accusation, and obviously I wasn't there, so I can't say for sure what happened, but I do think that's a rich accusation coming from an organization that practices the slap technique. I will say I have found some sources talking about a slap therapy, like that is a thing, but I have not seen anything connecting it to MFR. Actually, I've even seen a video by Cindy from Essential Therapy speaking out against it. That doesn't mean John doesn't practice this, just that I haven't found the connection online. I don't think Joel or John are reliable narrators, but I did want to point out the irony of the accusation if Joel's account is true. As questionable as I think Joel's experiences and his interpretations of them are, I will say he does make some good points about how manipulative this construct seems. People pay a lot of money for these seminars and retreats, and they expect to have a deep healing experience with the man himself, John Barnes. That can do a few things. It can create a sunk cost fallacy where people go along with practices even if they don't really agree, just because they spent a lot of money and time on them. It can also prompt people into forcing experiences just because they're expected to. When Joel tells the story of John elbowing him in the sacrum, he says it doesn't work. He says the technique was supposed to regress him to a traumatic moment in time, but he doesn't feel it, even though he is open to it. Which is wild, because if that was going to work on anyone, I think it would be Joel. During the session, he did a version of the slap technique, a sloppy technique intended to bring trauma to the surface, on my sacrum with his elbow. This didn't transport me back in time to the moment of impact as intended. I took some heavy falls on my coccyx while growing up snowboarding. But I did unwind the energy of his elbow making impact with my tailbone. However, the impression it gave the SES participants was that the slap technique worked as it was taught and performed by John in that moment, when in fact the impact and setup for that particular slap technique did nothing for me. It's not like I wasn't completely open to being transported back in time, because it certainly sounded cool at the time. But when he set it up and his elbow made contact, nothing happened, so I just played into the moment, and that led to an unwinding that authentically corrected/adjusted my lumbar spine. In other words, I was just being a good boy for John. It was in that moment I realized it was actually possible to fake a real unwinding just by playing into it. Which leads into a third good point Joel made, which is that people at these seminars allow themselves to be in this vulnerable state, literally in the hands of John and his instructors. My interpretation is that these people are highly suggestible, and that might be why they're having these unwinding experiences. If that's the case, that means they're also highly vulnerable to whatever John says. John and his instructors are the ones given authority to both prompt and interpret these unwinding experiences. And that's an awful lot of power to hold over someone. I honestly don't know how representative Joel's experience was, since well, I'd say his was the strangest I've encountered so far, but if you go into the comments of his part 1 video, you'll find a lot of people corroborating what he said there. People saying they got cult vibes, and John and his instructors were manipulative, and the prices were extortionate. But one thing that unites most of these people, and most of the skeptical people I've seen in other massage forums, is that they still like MFR itself. Joel even goes so far as to thank John for his teachings, regardless of how he feels about John himself. What does that say about this technique if people can blatantly call John Barnes a cult leader and still find value in his therapy?
Is there value in MFR?
One of the first questions I Googled about this topic was, is myofascial release legit? And even at the end of this, I'm really not sure how to answer that question. Do I think John Barnes is a credible source of information? Absolutely not. If he told me the sky was blue, I'd have to go look out the window myself. But is myofascial release a genuine form of therapy? Maybe. Scientific studies can be too preliminary, misleading, or even fraudulent, but they're still what I turn to first to determine if something works. And as of right now, the jury's out on MFR. Part of the problem is that practitioners perform the technique in so many unique ways, and a lot of studies and meta-analyses I've seen acknowledge this. It's even a problem from within MFR, since John Barnes and his followers seem to believe that they're the only ones practicing the correct techniques. At this stage, it's impossible to know if that's the case. How would a scientist be able to tell if a client really entered Channel 3 and unwound to trauma in their past life from 1703. But what about the mechanical aspects of MFR? What about all the things John says about gentle, sustained stretching and looking for the root cause of the pain? Those things sound reasonable to me. So many of the massage therapists I've seen express doubt about John Barnes have directed people instead to an MFR therapist and teacher named Walt Fritz. And I admit, I haven't looked into him as deeply as I have John Barnes, but what I've seen so far is extremely encouraging. I found a great interview on learnmuscles.com where he broke down his exit from John Barnes' MFR. Walt Fritz graduated as a physical therapist and then was trained under John Barnes, and he even instructed at John Barnes seminars for over a decade. But in his own words, they no longer saw eye to eye on many things, and Walt moved on to create his own practice in 2006. How is Walt's practice different? He says, quote, I reflected upon why I chose to leave my original training/teacher and began to craft my workshops with my own vision of providing less of a New Age-driven experience and utilize the best available science to explain all aspects of the work, end quote. Music to my ears. Here's another quote from Walt. Quote, I was having great success with the MFR I was taught, but began to understand that the supposed science presented in those workshops had little credibility or understanding beyond that peer group. Results were proof enough in my MFR family, and in most other modality groups, but this can lead to post hoc reasoning errors. I have success, so the story I was taught and retell myself as to the why must be true. Once I left that MFR group, I saw that most every modality line had similar claims of success, each laying claim to being the most effective/efficient modality for pain. They don't know what we know, so science be damned, they will catch up to us eventually, was a phrase often repeated in my trainings. And those are pretty heady concepts to believe, but I did, end quote. Wild how Walt Fritz just condensed my stupidly long video into one concise paragraph. Because that's really the takeaway, isn't it? Just because something works does not mean it works in the way it was explained to you. Did you really heal because you left your body and regressed to a point of trauma? Or is it because your therapist is just skilled at physical therapy? And maybe we don't have all the answers behind why this modality works, but Walt is excited about the science unfolding around it. It's such a contrast to John, who dismisses and downplays science at every turn. Walt's opinions also reflect the debate about trigger points and other myofascial treatments. It seems to me that all we really know is that people are in pain, but clinicians and therapists haven't reached a consensus about what causes the pain. Terms like trigger points or myofascial restrictions or even myofascial release may just be useful metaphors to help people visualize and practice therapy. That's how Walt approaches his own techniques. In fact, he's even moved away from calling his work myofascial release in recent years, because so many John Barnes devotees disagree with his views. And he also recognizes there's no evidence that he's really releasing fascia at all.
Over the past decade and a half, I've moved from a model of myofascial release, which was minimally evidence-based on purpose, it was said, because the best evidence was our patients' happiness and satisfaction, which of course that matters, but I learned we can do better. So, the last decade and a half, I've been really working to try and find a really good evidence-based approach model for teaching this work. I know I'll just call it manual therapy because I don't believe we can target the fascia selectively. It's like, how are we supposed to translate this, published research from working directly with the patient? Because in a way, that's what we're expected to do. We're supposed to take the best available evidence, interpret it, and then apply it to our patients. Number one, there's a lot of good studies out there. But number two, they're really difficult to translate into practice. And I think the onus should be on these researchers, should be on the people who are writing these papers and editors of journals to take a look at these papers and say, can we really expect that someone can follow through on these procedures based on what was written in the study?
What this proves to me is that it is possible to practice MFR in a way that is supported by those icky concepts of evidence and the scientific method. No ancient warrior necessary. Actually, it brings to mind a term I learned recently while researching something unrelated, something called purple hat therapy. It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek term for a type of therapy that adds something unnecessary on top of an existing therapy that works. Usually the creator of the purple hat therapy will say it's the extra addition that makes the therapy work, when in fact, the therapy already worked without it. In the case of myofascial release, there are plenty of different manual therapy modalities that offer pain relief. Chances are they work perfectly fine without exploring your past life trauma. At the end of all of this, I find myself agreeing with all of those therapists who say to shy away from practitioners who promote John Barnes as a guru, and I would steer people more towards people like Walt Fritz. I think John Barnes is just a man who happened to develop a therapy that works for a lot of people, much like other forms of physical therapy. Anyone who claims they're the only one with the solution, and their solution is a panacea for all that ails you, is probably just trying to sell you that solution. What this investigation showed me was that Linda Ann Kahn is even less of a credible source than I originally thought, and John Barnes himself gives speeches and seminars that are associated with real medicine. It makes me wonder how many other therapists buy into this pseudoscience and blend seamlessly into the medical field. It makes me wonder how many other forms of pseudoscience blend seamlessly into the medical field. Somehow I feel like this is only the tip of the iceberg. If you've made it this far, thank you for coming along this trip down the rabbit hole. This was something quite a bit different than my usual content, but it's something I feel passionate about, and I hope you enjoyed it too. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy my content, and I hope to see you again soon.
You know, when someone says to me, well, what are you feeling? What do you think is wrong with me? Those are interesting questions for us to answer. Can we answer them in 100% surety, in being factual, or are we answering the question based on our early training, our early education, our early experiences, all of which frame how we perceive? You know, when I touch somebody and I feel a thick, grumpy area, which is how I like to refer to it now, instead of calling it a trigger point, a knot, a fascial restriction, lymph pool, all those things that manual therapists and possibly exercise-based therapists might go to as well. But, you know, it's really difficult to tell a person what's going on there without driving back into our learned experiences earlier in our career, earlier in our life. I think it's a worthwhile one to explore. I don't know that I'll ever completely sponge this part of that fascial belief system from my brain, and maybe I don't need to. Maybe I just need to be aware of my biases and say, well, it could be something with your connective tissue, or it could be with the nervous system, or it could be a simple holding pattern that your body hasn't figured out a way to let go yet. But I think it's really interesting and educational for us to really examine our biases. That's it for today. Thanks for listening.